Welcome to Mythic Slumber, where ancient mysteries become gentle companions for rest. Tonight, we journey into the world of esoteric wisdom to explore the legendary Tablets of Thoth, texts that emerged from the meeting of Egyptian tradition and Greek philosophy in the centuries following Alexander's conquests. These are not stone tablets unearthed by archaeologists, but rather written teachings attributed to the god Thoth, the Egyptian deity of wisdom and writing, who became known to the Greeks as Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. We will trace the slow unfolding of these mysterious texts through time, following them from the scholarly halls of Hellenistic Egypt, through the quiet scriptoriums of medieval Islam, and into the libraries of Renaissance Europe, where alchemists and philosophers copied them by candlelight, seeking hidden knowledge in their cryptic verses. Let your breathing slow and your thoughts settle as we wander through this long history of seeking and interpretation, where the boundaries between mythology, philosophy, and mysticism blur into something dreamlike and strange. If you are new here and enjoy falling asleep to history, subscribing helps you find us again and supports more peaceful content like this. Now let us turn our attention to the figure of Thoth himself, the ancient Egyptian god who would become the mythical author of these texts, a deity whose worship stretched back thousands of years before the Greeks ever arrived on Egyptian soil. In the pantheon of ancient Egypt, Thoth occupied a unique position as the divine scribe, the inventor of writing and the keeper of sacred knowledge, often depicted as a man with the head of an ibis or sometimes as a baboon, both animals considered sacred to him. The Egyptians believed that Thoth had invented hieroglyphic writing, that he recorded the judgments of the dead in the underworld, weighing hearts against the feather of truth, and that he possessed knowledge of magic and hidden wisdom beyond the understanding of ordinary mortals. Temples dedicated to Thoth stood in several cities, most notably at Hermopolis, the city that the Greeks would later name after their own god Hermes, and priests in these temples maintained traditions of learning, astronomy, and the interpretation of omens that stretched back through countless generations. The association between Thoth and the Greek god Hermes developed gradually during the centuries when Greek culture spread across the eastern Mediterranean following Alexander's conquests in the late 4th century before the Common Era. The Greeks who settled in Egypt, and particularly in the new city of Alexandria, encountered Egyptian religion with a mixture of curiosity and interpretive flexibility, often identifying Egyptian deities with their own gods based on perceived similarities in function or character. Thoth, as a god of wisdom, writing, and magic, seemed a natural counterpart to Hermes, who in Greek tradition served as the messenger of the gods, the patron of travelers and merchants, and also possessed associations with cleverness, eloquence, and secret knowledge. Over time, these two figures merged in the Greek imagination into a single being, Hermes Trismegistus, whose name combined the Greek god with an epithet meaning thrice great, a title that may have reflected the Egyptian custom of repeating words for emphasis, or may have indicated mastery of 3 forms of wisdom. This syncretism, the blending of different religious traditions, was characteristic of the Hellenistic world, where cultures mingled and borrowed from one another in ways that created new forms of belief and practice. The actual texts that would become known as the Hermetic writings, including what would later be called the Emerald Tablet, began to appear in the early centuries of the Common Era, composed in Greek by anonymous authors who attributed their work to this mythical Hermes Trismegistus. These were not unified texts, but rather a diverse collection of treatises, dialogues, and fragments covering topics that range from philosophy and theology to astrology, alchemy, and magic, all presented as the ancient wisdom of Egypt channeled through this legendary figure. The philosophical Hermetica, texts like the Poimandres and the Asclepius, dealt with questions of cosmology, the nature of the divine, and the path to spiritual enlightenment, expressing ideas that blended Platonic philosophy with Egyptian religious concepts and elements of Jewish and early Christian thought. The technical Hermetica focused on practical matters of astrology, the making of talismans, the properties of stones and plants, and the transformation of base metals into gold, presenting these practices as part of a unified system of hidden knowledge passed down from the gods through their chosen intermediaries. Modern scholars recognize these texts as products of their time, reflecting the intellectual and spiritual concerns of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, but to medieval and Renaissance readers, they represented authentic ancient Egyptian wisdom, perhaps the oldest philosophy in the world. The most famous of these texts, the one that would capture imaginations for centuries to come, was a brief passage of perhaps a dozen sentences that became known as the Emerald Tablet, describing the secrets of creation and the principles by which the macrocosm of the universe mirrored the microcosm of the individual soul. The text began with the words, "as above, so below," a phrase that would echo through centuries of esoteric tradition, suggesting that the patterns and processes of the heavens were reflected in the earthly realm, and that understanding this correspondence was the key to both spiritual wisdom and material power. The tablet spoke of a cosmic unity, of how all things emerged from one source through the meditation of one thing, and of how the adept who understood these principles might separate the subtle from the gross, ascending from earth to heaven and descending again, thereby acquiring the power of both higher and lower things. Later tradition held that this text had been inscribed on an actual emerald tablet discovered in a cave or tomb, though no such artifact has ever been found, and the earliest references to the text appear in Arabic manuscripts from the 8th and 9th centuries, suggesting that it reached its familiar form during the Islamic Golden Age rather than in ancient Egypt itself. The transmission of Hermetic texts through the centuries followed the broader patterns of how knowledge moved across cultures and languages in the medieval world, passing from Greek into Syriac and Arabic as Islamic scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba sought out the learning of earlier civilizations. The Abbasid caliphs, who ruled from Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries, established translation bureaus where scholars rendered Greek philosophical, scientific, and esoteric texts into Arabic, preserving works that might otherwise have been lost and adding their own commentaries and interpretations. The Hermetic corpus attracted particular interest among Islamic alchemists and philosophers, who saw in these texts both practical knowledge about the transformation of substances and deeper spiritual teachings about the purification of the soul. The legendary alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the Latin West as Geber, wrote extensively on alchemical theory and practice, drawing on Hermetic ideas and developing elaborate systems of correspondences between metals, planets, and spiritual qualities. These Arabic Hermetic texts circulated through the Islamic world for centuries, copied in scriptoriums attached to mosques and madrasas, their margins filled with glosses and commentary by successive generations of readers. The knowledge preserved in Arabic manuscripts began to flow into Christian Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries, a period sometimes called the translation movement, when scholars working in places like Toledo, where Christian and Islamic cultures met, rendered Arabic texts into Latin, making them accessible to European readers. These translators worked slowly and carefully, often consulting with native Arabic speakers to ensure they captured not just the words but the meaning of complex philosophical and technical vocabulary, and their efforts opened European scholars to a vast library of learning that had been developing in the Islamic world while Europe struggled through its early medieval period. Among the texts translated were Hermetic writings, including versions of the Emerald Tablet, which appeared in Latin probably in the 12th century and quickly circulated among those interested in alchemy and natural philosophy. The text's cryptic language and bold claims about the secrets of creation fascinated medieval readers, who copied it, commented on it, and incorporated its principles into their own explorations of the natural world. The phrase "as above, so below" became a touchstone for those who believed that the universe was a unified whole, governed by hidden correspondences that the wise might learn to perceive and manipulate. European alchemy in the medieval and Renaissance periods developed into a complex tradition that was part practical chemistry, part spiritual discipline, and part symbolic meditation on transformation and perfection. Alchemists set up laboratories where they heated metals in crucibles, distilled liquids in elaborate glassware, and recorded their observations in notebooks filled with cryptic symbols and allegorical language, seeking both the transmutation of base metals into gold and the creation of the philosopher's stone, a substance believed to grant immortality and perfect wisdom. These practitioners saw their work as following in the footsteps of Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary founder of their art, and they frequently cited the Emerald Tablet as expressing the fundamental principles underlying their operations. The tablet's instruction to separate the subtle from the gross was interpreted as referring to the alchemical processes of distillation and purification, while its description of ascending from earth to heaven and descending again seemed to mirror the cycles of heating and cooling, dissolution and crystallization that characterized alchemical work. The parallels between physical transformation and spiritual development were intentional, for many alchemists understood their practice as an inner work as much as an outer one, the purification of their own souls proceeding alongside the refinement of material substances in their vessels. The Renaissance, with its renewed interest in ancient learning and its belief that the wisdom of the ancients surpassed that of more recent times, saw a flourishing of interest in Hermetic texts, which were now viewed as among the most ancient and authoritative sources of philosophical truth. In 1463, an Italian scholar brought a manuscript containing a collection of Hermetic treatises to the court of Cosimo de' Medici in Florence, and Cosimo commissioned the young scholar Marsilio Ficino, who had been engaged in translating Plato's works, to set aside that project and translate the newly discovered Hermetic corpus first. So eager was he to access this supposedly more ancient wisdom. Ficino completed his translation of the Corpus Hermeticum in 1463 or 1464, and it was printed in 1471, making these texts widely available for the first time and sparking enormous interest among humanist scholars, philosophers, and those drawn to esoteric traditions. Ficino and others believed they were reading texts that predated Plato and Moses, ancient Egyptian wisdom that had influenced all subsequent philosophy and religion, and they found in the Hermetic writings confirmation of their own Christian Platonist beliefs about the dignity of human nature and the possibility of ascending toward union with the divine through contemplation and right living. The Hermetic texts influenced a remarkable range of Renaissance thinkers, from the philosopher Pico della Mirandola, who saw in them support for his belief in the unity of all truth across different religious traditions, to the mystic Jacob Boehme, who incorporated Hermetic ideas about correspondence and spiritual transformation into his visions of cosmic history and redemption. The metaphor of the world as a great book written by God, which humans might learn to read by understanding the hidden connections between things, became a common theme in Renaissance thought, and the Hermetic principle "as above, so below" provided a framework for thinking about these connections. Natural magicians like Giordano Bruno and Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa drew on Hermetic texts to develop elaborate systems of talismans, astral images, and ritual practices designed to bring the practitioner into harmony with cosmic forces, while physicians like Paracelsus reinterpreted medical theory in light of alchemical and Hermetic principles, arguing that diseases were caused by imbalances that could be corrected through medicines prepared according to alchemical procedures. The boundary between what we would now call science and what we would call magic was not yet firmly drawn, and many of those who pursued knowledge of the natural world saw no contradiction in combining careful observation with the study of ancient esoteric texts. The status of the Hermetic writings as ancient Egyptian wisdom began to erode in the 17th century when the scholar Isaac Casaubon, through careful philological analysis of the Greek in which the texts were written, demonstrated that they could not have been composed in remote antiquity but must date from the early centuries of the Common Era, making them products of the Hellenistic and Roman world rather than the ancient Egypt that preceded them. Casaubon published his findings in 1614, and while some continued to defend the antiquity of the texts, his arguments gradually gained acceptance among scholars, who came to view the Hermetic corpus as an interesting example of late antique thought rather than as a repository of primordial wisdom. This shift in understanding paralleled broader changes in how European intellectuals approached knowledge, with increasing emphasis on empirical observation, mathematical demonstration, and critical analysis of sources rather than on the authority of ancient texts, however mysterious or venerable they might appear. The Hermetic writings did not disappear from circulation, but they lost the central position they had occupied in Renaissance thought, becoming objects of antiquarian interest rather than living sources of philosophical or spiritual guidance for most educated readers. The tradition of Hermeticism continued, carried forward by those who valued the texts for their spiritual and symbolic content rather than for their historical authenticity, finding in them resources for mystical contemplation, alchemical practice, and the exploration of consciousness. Esoteric societies in the 18th and 19th centuries, including Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and various occult orders, drew on Hermetic ideas and imagery, incorporating the Emerald Tablet and other Hermetic principles into their rituals and teachings, often blending them with elements from other mystical traditions to create syncretic systems of belief and practice. The phrase "as above, so below" became a commonplace in occult literature, invoked to explain the correspondences between planets and metals, between colors and spiritual states, between the structure of the cosmos and the composition of the human being, and the figure of Hermes Trismegistus remained a symbol of hidden wisdom and the possibility of transforming both matter and spirit through the application of secret knowledge. These traditions continued into the 20th century and beyond, adapting to new cultural contexts, but maintaining a thread of continuity with the Hermetic texts composed so many centuries earlier by anonymous authors in Hellenistic Egypt who sought to articulate their understanding of the cosmos and the human place within it by attributing their insights to the ancient Egyptian god of wisdom. Modern scholars approach the Hermetic texts as historical documents that reveal much about the intellectual and spiritual world of late antiquity, a time when different religious and philosophical traditions mixed and influenced one another in ways that produced new forms of thought and practice. The texts show us how Greek philosophy, particularly Platonism and Stoicism, could be combined with Egyptian religious concepts, how ideas about the cosmos and the soul circulated across cultures and languages, and how people in the Roman Empire sought meaning and transcendence through esoteric knowledge and ritual practice. The attribution of these texts to Hermes Trismegistus, rather than being a simple forgery, reflects the ancient practice of pseudepigraphy, writing in the name of a revered figure to claim authority for one's teachings and to place them within a prestigious tradition, a practice common in philosophical, religious, and technical writing throughout antiquity. Understanding the Hermetic corpus in its historical context does not diminish its interest, but rather enriches our appreciation of how these texts functioned in their own time and how they continued to inspire and influence readers across the centuries, adapting to new contexts while maintaining their aura of mystery and their promise of hidden wisdom waiting to be discovered by the patient seeker. The philosophical teachings contained within the Hermetic corpus, those texts concerned with the nature of divinity, the cosmos, and the human soul, presented a vision of reality that resonated deeply with seekers across many centuries, offering both an explanation of how the universe came to be and a path by which the individual might achieve wisdom and spiritual liberation. These teachings were typically presented as dialogues between Hermes Trismegistus and his students, most often his son Tat or his disciple Asclepius, a format borrowed from Greek philosophical tradition but infused with the authority of revealed wisdom rather than merely reasoned argument. The tone of these dialogues was reverent and mystical, with Hermes speaking as one who had received divine illumination and now shared that light with those capable of receiving it, often cautioning that these teachings should be guarded carefully and shared only with those who had proven themselves worthy through virtue and dedication to truth. The structure of question and answer allowed complex ideas to unfold gradually, with the students' questions giving shape to the teacher's explanations and the reader experiencing a sense of being initiated into mysteries that required patience and contemplation to fully understand. The creation story presented in the Poemandres, one of the most important texts in the philosophical Hermetic corpus, began with Hermes falling into a deep contemplation, a state between waking and sleeping in which his ordinary senses fell silent and his mind opened to a vision of ultimate reality. In this altered state, a vast being appeared to him, identifying itself as Poimandres, the mind of sovereignty, the supreme divine intellect from which all things proceed, and proceeded to reveal the secrets of creation and the origin of humanity. Hermes saw in vision how from the original divine unity there emerged light, which was the creative mind, and how this light separated from darkness, which was matter in its primordial, formless state, and how between them arose the ordered cosmos, structured by the divine word speaking through the light. This account echoed both the opening of the book of Genesis, with its description of light emerging from darkness, and Platonic cosmology, with its distinction between the realm of eternal forms and the realm of material becoming, but presented these ideas as part of a unified revelation from the divine mind itself rather than as separate traditions. The vision continued with an account of how humanity came into being, a story that explained both human dignity and human bondage to material existence, the glory of possessing divine intellect, and the tragedy of being trapped in mortal bodies subject to passion and decay. According to this teaching, the supreme God, the divine mind, generated a second God, the demiurge or craftsman, who fashioned the physical cosmos with its 7 planetary spheres, and this cosmos was beautiful and good, reflecting the divine pattern. The divine mind then created a being in its own image, the archetypal human or anthropos, who possessed divine intellect and creative power, and this being was so beautiful that the cosmos itself fell in love with him, and he in turn was drawn to the material creation he beheld reflected in the waters below. Descending through the planetary spheres, taking on something of the nature of each sphere as he passed, this divine being united with material nature, and from this union arose mortal humanity, beings who partake of both divine and material nature, capable of ascending back to the divine through knowledge, but also susceptible to being weighed down by bodily pleasures and earthly attachments. This myth of the soul's descent and potential ascent became central to Hermetic thought, providing both an explanation for human suffering and a promise of liberation for those who pursued wisdom. The teaching held that human beings in their current state are not what they were meant to be, that the divine spark within them has become clouded by identification with the body and its passions, and that the path to restoration requires recognizing one's true nature as essentially divine rather than material. The process of awakening involves shedding the qualities acquired during the soul's descent through the planetary spheres, the anger and desire and other passions that bound the soul to material existence, and cultivating instead the virtues and knowledge that allowed the soul to ascend back through those same spheres toward reunion with the divine mind. This was not presented as an easy or automatic process, but as a difficult path requiring discipline, contemplation, and moral transformation, a gradual purification that might take an entire lifetime or even extend beyond a single life into subsequent existences. For some Hermetic texts hinted at the transmigration of souls, the teaching that souls might be reborn into new bodies until they achieved the wisdom necessary for final liberation. The emphasis on knowledge as the means of salvation distinguished Hermetic thought from other religious movements of the time that emphasized faith, ritual observance, or divine grace as the primary means by which humans might be saved. The Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge, gave its name to various Gnostic movements in the early centuries of the Common Era. And while the Hermetic texts are distinct from Christian Gnostic writings, they share this fundamental conviction that true knowledge of divine reality, not mere belief or practice, transforms the knower and effects salvation. This knowledge was not intellectual understanding in the ordinary sense, not the accumulation of facts or the mastery of logical arguments, but rather a direct, experiential knowing of divine reality, an illumination of the mind that revealed the true nature of self and cosmos simultaneously. Such knowledge could not be fully communicated through words, but had to be experienced directly, though texts and teachings could prepare the ground and point the way, clearing away false beliefs and directing attention toward the ultimate reality that lay beyond conceptual thought. The teacher's role was not to transfer information, but to awaken the divine intellect already present, though dormant, within the student. The ethical teachings of the Hermetic texts flowed naturally from this metaphysical vision, calling on those who sought wisdom to withdraw from excessive attachment to bodily pleasures and worldly concerns, to cultivate self-knowledge and contemplation, and to practice virtues that aligned the soul with its divine source. The text did not advocate complete withdrawal from the world or extreme asceticism, but rather a measured detachment, engaging in necessary activities while maintaining awareness that one's true identity transcended material circumstances. Piety toward the divine, reverence for the order of the cosmos, and compassion toward other human beings who likewise carried the divine spark within them were all enjoined as natural consequences of understanding the true nature of reality. The texts warned against the deception of the senses, which present material reality as solid and ultimate when it is actually transient and derivative, and against the tyranny of passions, which arise from identifying with the body and its needs, rather than recognizing oneself as fundamentally spirit temporarily dwelling in flesh. The wise person learned to use the body and engage with the world while remaining inwardly free, maintaining a stance of philosophical detachment that preserved the soul's orientation toward its divine homeland. The technical Hermetic texts, those concerned with astrology, alchemy, and magic, approached the same fundamental vision of cosmic unity and correspondence from a different angle, focusing on practical applications of the principle that the universe is an interconnected whole in which actions at one level can influence conditions at another. Astrology, the study of how celestial bodies influence earthly affairs, rested on the assumption that the planets and stars were not merely physical objects, but living, divine beings, whose movements and configurations shape the qualities of time and the destinies of individuals born under their influence. Each planet was associated with particular qualities, metals, plants, stones, and spiritual virtues, and understanding these correspondences allowed the astrologer to interpret the meaning of celestial patterns and to predict how their influence would unfold in human affairs. The 7 traditional planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon, corresponded to the 7 planetary spheres through which the soul descended in the Hermetic creation myth, and their movements traced patterns in the sky that reflected and influenced the unfolding of events on Earth, making the heavens a kind of divine script that those with knowledge might learn to read. The practice of making talismans, Objects inscribed with symbols and consecrated through ritual to channel specific celestial influences emerged from this same worldview of cosmic sympathy and correspondence. A talisman might be a metal disc engraved with the symbol of a particular planet and the spirits associated with it, created at a time when that planet was favorably positioned in the sky. The metal used corresponding to the planet through traditional associations: copper for Venus, iron for Mars, tin for Jupiter, and so on. The practitioner would recite prayers or invocations during the creation of the talisman, suffumigating it with incenses appropriate to the planetary influence and observing various ritual requirements designed to align the object with the cosmic forces it was meant to embody. Once completed, such a talisman was believed to carry the influence of the planet within it, providing protection, healing, success in ventures, or other benefits associated with that celestial power. Modern observers might see this as sympathetic magic based on mistaken beliefs about causation, but to its practitioners, it represented the practical application of true knowledge about how the cosmos actually functions. No different in principle than using herbal remedies based on understanding the properties of plants. Another practice that relied on recognizing hidden correspondences between substances and effects. Alchemy, the art of transformation, drew together many threads of Hermetic teaching, combining practical work with material substances, with philosophical and spiritual interpretations of that work, so that the processes carried out in the laboratory became symbols and enactments of inner transformation. The fundamental alchemical operation was to take base or impure substances and through various procedures of heating, dissolving, distilling, and recombining, transform them into purer, more perfect forms, ultimately producing gold from lesser metals or creating the philosopher's stone, a mysterious substance described in contradictory and symbolic terms that was said to perfect whatever it touched. The alchemists understood that physical gold was not merely a metal, but the material embodiment of solar perfection, the earthly correspondent of the sun among the planets, and that creating gold artificially was therefore participating in the divine work of perfecting matter, bringing earthly substances into alignment with their heavenly archetypes. The procedures required patience, precise timing, careful observation of color changes, and other signs that indicated the progress of the work, and above all, the proper state of mind in the practitioner. For many alchemists believed that the work would succeed only if the operator was spiritually prepared and aligned with the cosmic forces being invoked. The stages of the alchemical process were described through a bewildering variety of images and symbols, with different texts and practitioners using different terminology, but certain patterns recur across the tradition, suggesting a shared understanding despite the cryptic language. The work typically began with a stage called nigredo, or blackening, in which the material in the vessel turned black, representing the death or putrefaction of the original substance, the necessary dissolution that preceded new creation. This was followed by albedo, or whitening, when the blackened material was purified and turned white, symbolizing purification and the emergence of the spiritual essence from the gross matter. The final stage, rubedo, or reddening, produced the red stone or red tincture, the ultimate goal of the work, the substance capable of transmuting base metals into gold and conferring spiritual and physical perfection. These color changes had spiritual equivalents in the transformation of the alchemist's own soul, with the blackening representing the death of the ego and worldly attachments, the whitening the purification of consciousness, and the reddening the achievement of spiritual illumination and union with the divine, so that the laboratory work served as both practical chemistry and spiritual discipline, the outer and inner works proceeding together. The symbolism of the alchemical marriage, the union of opposites that produced the philosopher's stone, drew on both chemical observations and mystical theology. presenting transformation as emerging from the reconciliation of contrary principles. In chemical terms, this involved combining substances identified as male and female, active and passive, sulfur and mercury, fire and water, and through their union in the sealed vessel of the alchemist's flask, producing something new that transcended both original substances. The imagery often became explicitly sexual, with texts describing the mating of king and queen, sun and moon, brother and sister, presenting generation and birth as models for the creative process by which base matter was elevated to spiritual perfection. This use of erotic symbolism had deep roots in ancient mystery religions and continued in various forms through medieval and Renaissance esoteric thought, based on the recognition that sexual union was itself a manifestation of the cosmic principle by which opposites come together to generate new life, and that this principle operated at every level of reality, from the joining of male and female in human reproduction to the union of spirit and matter in the cosmos, to the ultimate reunion of the individual soul with the divine source. The relationship between the practical operations of alchemy and their spiritual interpretations remained complex and debated even among practitioners, with some emphasizing the literal transformation of physical substances and others treating the material work as primarily symbolic of inner transformation. Many alchemists pursued both dimensions simultaneously, believing that the outer work in the laboratory and the inner work of spiritual development were connected, and that success in one supported success in the other. That purifying substances in the crucible helped to purify the soul, and that spiritual advancement increased one's ability to successfully complete the physical operations. The sealed vessel in which the alchemical work took place, called the alembic, or the philosophical egg, became a symbol of the individual practitioner's own mind and body, the contained space within which transformation could occur through the careful application of heat, time, and the right combinations of elements. The process could not be rushed, for transformation required the slow ripening of conditions, the gradual working through of necessary stages that could not be skipped, and the alchemist learned patience through the long hours spent tending the fire, observing subtle changes and waiting for signs that the work was progressing as it should, all the while reflecting on the parallels between what occurred in the vessel and what needed to occur within the self. The transmission of alchemical knowledge followed patterns similar to other forms of esoteric wisdom, passing through chains of teachers and students. Recorded in manuscripts whose symbolic language protected the secrets from the uninitiated, while allowing those with proper training to understand and adapted over time to incorporate new observations and ideas while maintaining continuity with tradition. Alchemical manuscripts were often beautifully illustrated, filled with strange images of dragons and lions, suns and moons, kings and queens, skeletons and phoenixes rising from flames, each image carrying multiple layers of meaning that the trained alchemist could decode, while the casual reader saw only decorative fantasy. These images served mnemonic functions, helping practitioners remember complex procedures and principles, and also functioned as meditative devices, objects for contemplation that could reveal deeper understanding to those who studied them with proper attention. The texts themselves were intentionally obscure, using coded language, cryptic metaphors, and deliberate misdirection to ensure that only the dedicated and properly prepared could understand the actual procedures being described. A practice justified by the belief that such powerful knowledge could be dangerous in the wrong hands, and that the work itself would succeed only for those who approached it with proper reverence and preparation. The movement of Hermetic texts and ideas from the Greek-speaking world into the Islamic intellectual tradition occurred during a period of remarkable cultural openness and scholarly activity, when translators working under the patronage of caliphs and wealthy nobles rendered the philosophical and scientific heritage of antiquity into Arabic, preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost and creating the foundation for centuries of Islamic philosophy, science, and mysticism. The translation movement began in earnest during the late 8th century under the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur and reached its height under his successors, particularly al-Mamun, who established the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a library and translation institute where Christian, Jewish and Muslim scholars worked together to translate Greek, Syriac and Persian texts into Arabic. The Hermetic corpus was among the many Greek philosophical and technical texts that attracted the attention of these translators, who saw in them valuable knowledge about the natural world and spiritual reality that complemented and enriched Islamic learning. The Arabic translations of Hermetic texts became known collectively as writings attributed to Hermes, and they circulated widely throughout the Islamic world, influencing philosophers, alchemists, astrologers, and mystical thinkers for centuries to come. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus was readily absorbed into Islamic tradition, where he was identified with the prophet Idris, mentioned in the Quran, a righteous man whom God raised to a lofty station, and also with the antediluvian patriarch Enoch from biblical tradition, who walked with God and was taken up to heaven without experiencing death. This identification allowed Muslim scholars to accept Hermetic teachings as part of the ancient wisdom given by God to humanity through prophets who preceded Muhammad, making these texts not foreign imports, but part of the broader stream of divine revelation that included Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Some Islamic writers developed elaborate genealogies connecting Hermes to various prophets and sages, suggesting there had been 3 different figures named Hermes across the generations, one who lived before the flood and taught astronomy and mathematics, one who rebuilt the Egyptian temples after the flood and taught medicine and alchemy, and one who taught philosophy and the interpretation of divine mysteries. This multiplication of Hermes figures allowed Islamic scholars to account for the diversity of topics covered in texts attributed to him while maintaining his status as a prophet and receiver of divine wisdom. Islamic philosophy in the medieval period developed into a sophisticated tradition that engaged deeply with Greek philosophical texts, particularly the works of Aristotle and Plato, interpreting them through the lens of Islamic theology and incorporating insights from other sources, including Hermetic and Neoplatonic writings. Philosophers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna, constructed comprehensive philosophical systems that addressed questions of metaphysics, cosmology, psychology, and ethics, seeking to demonstrate the harmony between reason and revelation, between the truths accessible through philosophical inquiry and those given through prophetic revelation. These thinkers found in Hermetic texts support for their understanding of the cosmos as a hierarchical system emanating from a single divine source, with different levels of reality descending from the pure unity of God through the realm of intellects and souls down to the material world, and they appreciated the Hermetic emphasis on knowledge as the path to spiritual perfection and reunion with the divine. The Hermetic concept of the microcosm and macrocosm, the idea that the human being is a miniature cosmos reflecting the structure of the universe as a whole, resonated with Islamic philosophical anthropology and became a commonplace in medieval Islamic thought about human nature and spiritual development. The practice of alchemy flourished particularly vigorously in the Islamic world, where it attracted practitioners who combined practical experimentation with theoretical speculation about the nature of matter and transformation. The legendary figure of Jabir ibn Hayyan, said to have lived in the 8th century, became associated with an enormous corpus of alchemical writings that may have been compiled over several centuries by multiple authors working in a common tradition. These texts, whether written by a single Jabir or by a school of alchemists using that name, developed elaborate theoretical frameworks for understanding chemical processes, introducing concepts like the sulfur-mercury theory of metals, which held that all metals were composed of varying proportions of an abstract philosophical sulfur representing the principle of combustibility and a philosophical Mercury representing the principle of fusibility and malleability. This was not meant as a literal claim about the physical composition of metals, but as a theoretical model that could explain their different properties and guide attempts to transmute one metal into another by adjusting the balance of these principles. The Jabarian corpus drew extensively on Hermetic ideas, citing Hermes as an ancient master of the art and incorporating Hermetic principles about correspondence and cosmic sympathy into its alchemical theory. Islamic alchemists established laboratories where they conducted systematic experiments with a wide range of substances, developing techniques of distillation, crystallization, sublimation, and other chemical processes that would later be adopted by European chemists, and they devised specialized equipment including various forms of stills, furnaces, and vessels designed for specific operations. The experimental dimension of Islamic alchemy was more developed than what had existed in the earlier Greek alchemical tradition, with practitioners carefully observing and recording the results of their operations, noting what happened when different substances were combined under different conditions, and gradually accumulating a body of empirical knowledge about the behavior of materials, even as they pursued the ultimate goal of transmutation. The line between what we would now call chemistry and what we would call alchemy was not yet drawn, and the same practitioners who sought to make gold from base metals also discovered or refined practical procedures for manufacturing acids, preparing medicines, dyeing fabrics, and working with minerals, contributing to the growth of practical technological knowledge alongside their pursuit of alchemical transformation. The mystical dimension of Islamic thought, expressed through the tradition known as Sufism, found resources in Hermetic texts for articulating experiences of divine presence and spiritual transformation that sometimes strained the boundaries of orthodox theology. Sufi masters taught that beyond the outer, literal meaning of scripture lay inner, esoteric meanings accessible only to those who had purified their hearts and awakened their spiritual perception, and they developed practices of meditation, ritual prayer, recitation of divine names, and ascetic discipline designed to lead the seeker through stages of spiritual development toward the ultimate goal of union with God. The Hermetic emphasis on gnosis, on direct experiential knowledge of divine reality rather than mere intellectual assent to doctrines, resonated with Sufi teaching about the difference between theoretical knowledge and experiential realization, and some Sufi writers drew on Hermetic concepts and imagery to describe their own experiences and teachings. The Hermetic idea that the human being contains within themselves the potential to know God directly, that the divine spark within the human soul can be awakened through spiritual discipline and illuminated through divine grace, found parallels in Sufi teaching about the perfect human being who serves as a mirror for divine attributes and a bridge between creation and creator. One of the most influential mystical philosophers in the Islamic tradition, Ibn Arabi, who lived in the 12th and 13th centuries and whose writings would shape Islamic mysticism for centuries to come, developed concepts that echoed and elaborated Hermetic themes about the relationship between divine unity and cosmic multiplicity. Ibn Arabi taught the doctrine of the unity of being, the idea that all existence is ultimately one, that the apparent multiplicity of creatures is a manifestation of the single divine reality in countless forms, and that the enlightened mystic perceives this underlying unity while still acknowledging the reality of the manifest world. This teaching had much in common with Hermetic and Neoplatonic ideas about emanation, about how the many proceed from the one while remaining ultimately identical with their source, and it provided a framework for understanding both the cosmos and the spiritual path in terms of a circular movement from unity into multiplicity and back to unity. Ibn Arabi wrote extensively about the perfect human being, the fully realized spiritual master who serves as the goal of creation and the means by which God knows himself through creation, and his descriptions of this perfect human incorporated both Quranic and prophetic imagery and concepts drawn from the philosophical tradition, including Hermetic ideas about the human as microcosm. The transmission of Hermetic and alchemical texts from the Islamic world into medieval Christian Europe occurred through multiple channels, with the most important being the translation schools that emerged in regions where Christian and Islamic cultures were in contact, particularly in Spain and Sicily. The city of Toledo, which had been under Islamic rule until its conquest by Christian forces in 1075, became a major centre for translation in the 12th century, with scholars from across Europe travelling there to access Arabic manuscripts and work with translators who could render them into Latin. These translators often worked in teams, with a scholar fluent in Arabic reading the text aloud in the vernacular language, Castilian Spanish, or sometimes spoken Latin, while a Latin scholar wrote down the translation, refining the language to create a readable Latin text that could circulate in the scholarly world. The process was slow and required careful attention to technical vocabulary, particularly in scientific and philosophical texts, where Arabic had developed precise terminology that did not always have clear Latin equivalents, and the translators often left certain key terms untranslated, creating a technical vocabulary of Arabicized Latin that became standard in medieval European discussions of these topics. Gerard of Cremona, one of the most prolific translators of the 12th century, rendered dozens of Arabic texts into Latin during his decades of work in Toledo, including important works of astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, among them Arabic alchemical texts that incorporated Hermetic ideas and attributed writings of Hermes himself. Through Gerard's translations and those of his contemporaries and successors, European scholars gained access to a vast library of Arabic learning that greatly expanded the intellectual horizons of Latin Christendom, providing new resources for the study of nature, new logical and philosophical tools for theological reflection, and new sources of wonder about the possibilities of human knowledge and power. The impact of this translation movement on European intellectual life can hardly be overstated, for it provided much of the foundation for the revival of learning that occurred in the 12th and 13th centuries. The period sometimes called the Renaissance of the 12th century, when cathedral schools and then universities emerged as centres of learning, and European scholars began to develop new philosophical and scientific traditions building on the Greek and Arabic sources now available to them. The Emerald Tablet, that brief text setting forth the principle of correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm, appeared in Latin probably in the mid-12th century, and its enigmatic phrases quickly became canonical in European alchemical literature. The Latin version began with the words verum sine mendatio, certum et verissimum, true without falsehood, certain and most true, establishing the text's claim to authentic wisdom, and continued with the famous principle quod est inferius, est, sicut, quod est superius, what is below is like what is above, the Latin rendering of the principle that would be more commonly quoted in the form as above, so below. The text went on to describe the work of the sun, how all things were created through the meditation of one thing, how the Father is the sun and the Mother the moon, how the wind carried it in its belly and the earth nursed it, and how through the operation of ascending from earth to heaven and descending again to earth, one acquired the force of things both superior and inferior. These cryptic statements could be interpreted on multiple levels, as descriptions of alchemical procedures, as cosmological principles, as spiritual teachings about the soul's journey, and as practical instructions for creating talismans or working with natural magic, and medieval commentators wrote extensively trying to unpack their meaning, producing treatises that were often longer and more complex than the brief text they purported to explain. European alchemists in the 13th and 14th centuries developed traditions of practice and interpretation that drew heavily on both Arabic sources and their own experimental work, gradually creating a distinctively Latin alchemy that would flourish through the Renaissance and into the early modern period. Figures like Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar and philosopher who wrote about both natural philosophy and alchemy, argued that the transmutation of metals was theoretically possible based on Aristotelian natural philosophy, which held that all matter was composed of the same fundamental substance, differentiated only by the balance of elementary qualities, hotness, coldness, dryness, and moistness, which meant that changing one substance into another should be possible through the right manipulation of these qualities. Other medieval writers were more skeptical about the possibility of alchemical transmutation, arguing that the species of things were fixed by their substantial forms and could not be changed by any human art, and debates about the legitimacy of alchemy continued throughout the medieval period, with some regarding it as a legitimate natural science, while others dismissed it as fraudulent or even diabolical. The ambiguous status of alchemy, neither clearly accepted nor completely rejected by learned authorities, would persist for centuries. The practical dimension of medieval European alchemy included both legitimate work with substances that contributed to technological development and fraudulent practices by charlatans who claimed to possess the secret of making gold and used that claim to extract money from gullible patrons. Genuine alchemical practitioners, those seriously pursuing the work, established laboratories where they heated minerals in crucibles, dissolved substances in acids they had carefully prepared, distilled liquids through spiral tubes cooled by water, and attempted to reproduce the procedures described in the cryptic language of alchemical texts. They observed how different metals responded to fire, how sulfur combined with mercury, how various salts dissolved and crystallized, and how colors changed during heating and cooling cycles, and they recorded their observations in notebooks that mix practical details with theoretical speculation and symbolic interpretation. The equipment they used, much of it adapted from earlier Islamic designs, included various types of furnaces for maintaining different levels of heat, alembics and retorts for distillation, crucibles for melting metals, and sealed vessels for operations requiring containment, and the art of glassblowing developed in part to supply alchemists with the specialized vessels their work required. The social world of medieval alchemy included both wealthy patrons who funded alchemical research in hopes of financial gain or medical benefit, and practitioners who lived modestly, supporting themselves through other crafts while pursuing the great work in their spare time. Some alchemists were associated with universities and combined their alchemical interests with teaching medicine or natural philosophy, while others worked independently or as part of small circles of like-minded seekers who shared knowledge and encouraged one another in the difficult work. The relationships between alchemists involved both collaboration and secrecy, for while there was a tradition of masters instructing students and passing on their knowledge, there was also a strong sense that the most important secrets should not be widely shared, and that only those who proved themselves worthy through dedication and moral purity should receive the full teaching. This tension between the desire to share knowledge and the need to protect it from misuse shaped how alchemical texts were written, with their layers of symbolic language serving simultaneously to communicate with the informed reader and to obscure meaning from the uninitiated. And it shaped the social organization of alchemical practice, which often took the form of master-student relationships or small brotherhoods rather than public institutions. The Renaissance brought a fundamental shift in how European intellectuals approached the Hermetic texts, transforming them from one source among many in the alchemical and magical traditions into a central pillar of philosophical and religious thought, texts that seem to offer an ancient wisdom predating and informing all subsequent philosophy. This elevation of Hermeticism occurred within the broader context of Renaissance humanism, the movement that sought to recover and study the texts of classical antiquity as a way of revitalizing contemporary culture and learning, and that believed the ancients had possessed wisdom that medieval civilization had lost or obscured. Humanist scholars learned Greek, edited and translated classical texts, established better chronologies of ancient history, and sought to understand the classical world on its own terms rather than through the lens of later Christian interpretation. Into this context of renewed interest in ancient wisdom came manuscripts of Hermetic texts that seemed to represent the most ancient philosophy of all, the wisdom of Egypt that supposedly predated even the Greeks, and these texts were received with enormous enthusiasm by scholars eager to access the sources from which later philosophy had flowed. The arrival of a Greek manuscript containing the Corpus Hermeticum at the Medici court in Florence in 1463 marked a turning point in the European reception of Hermetic texts, for although fragments and Latin translations of some Hermetic writings had circulated in medieval Europe, this manuscript provided a substantial collection of philosophical Hermetic treatises in their original Greek, making possible a more complete and accurate understanding of this ancient wisdom tradition. Cosimo de' Medici, the elderly patriarch of Florence's ruling family and a patron of learning and the arts, immediately recognized the importance of the manuscript and instructed his protege Marsilio Ficino to set aside his work translating Plato and translate the Hermetic texts first. So eager was he to access this ancient wisdom before his death. Ficino, who had been trained in both philosophy and medicine, and who possessed a deep interest in the relationship between ancient wisdom traditions and Christian truth, completed the translation remarkably quickly, working through 1463 and early 1464, and Cosimo was able to hear or read the translation before his death in August of 1464. The translation was subsequently revised and printed in 1471, making it widely available across Europe and sparking an explosion of interest in Hermeticism that would influence philosophy, theology, magic, and science for the next century and beyond. Ficino's own philosophical project, which occupied him for decades and produced translations of Plato, Plotinus, and other ancient philosophical texts, along with original works synthesizing these traditions, placed Hermetic wisdom at the foundation of an ancient theology, a Prisca Theologia, that supposedly stretched back to the earliest times and found its fulfillment in Christianity. According to this scheme, divine truth had been revealed to ancient sages, including Hermes Trismegistus, Zoroaster, Orpheus, and Pythagoras, who had passed it down through various philosophical schools until it reached Plato, and this ancient wisdom had prepared the Greek world to receive the fuller revelation of Christian truth when it arrived. The Hermetic texts, in this understanding, were not pagan documents to be rejected, but rather preparatory revelations that anticipated Christian doctrines and could be used to demonstrate the universal truth of Christianity to educated readers formed by classical culture. Ficino found in the Hermetic writings discussions of the divine as a triune unity, teachings about the Word through which creation occurred, and descriptions of spiritual rebirth that seemed to foreshadow Christian sacraments, and he argued that these parallels demonstrated that the ancient Egyptians had received genuine divine illumination that pointed toward the coming of Christ. This interpretation of Hermetic texts as ancient theology, compatible with and supportive of Christianity, allowed Renaissance scholars to embrace these writings enthusiastically without feeling they were abandoning their Christian faith, and it provided a framework for exploring ideas about the divine, the cosmos, and human nature that sometimes pressed against the boundaries of orthodox theology. The Hermetic emphasis on the dignity and divine potential of humanity, the teaching that humans contained within themselves the capacity to know God directly and even to participate in divine creative power, resonated deeply with Renaissance humanist values and provided philosophical support for the period's celebration of human achievement in arts and sciences. The famous oration on the dignity of man, composed by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a younger contemporary of Ficino who shared his interest in ancient wisdom traditions, drew on Hermetic ideas in presenting humans as beings uniquely capable of determining their own nature, able to descend to the level of beasts through vice or ascend to divine status through virtue and contemplation, occupying a pivotal position in the cosmic hierarchy where their choices mattered and their potential seemed limitless. Pico della Mirandola went further than Ficino in his enthusiasm for diverse wisdom traditions, arguing that truth could be found in many sources and that the wise seeker should learn from Chaldean astrology, Jewish Kabbalah, Islamic philosophy, and Greek mysteries as well as from Christian revelation, for all these traditions ultimately pointed toward the same fundamental truths about God and creation. His ambitious project of publishing 900 theses drawn from all these sources and defending them in public debate was never realized, as church authorities found some of his propositions heretical and condemned them, but his vision of a universal philosophy synthesizing all wisdom traditions influenced many later thinkers and contributed to the development of Christian Kabbalah and other syncretic esoteric traditions in the Renaissance. The Hermetic texts played a central role in Pico's thinking, providing both specific doctrines and a general model of how ancient wisdom could be recovered and synthesized, and his work helped establish Hermeticism as a respectable subject of study for learned Christians seeking to deepen their understanding of divine mysteries through the study of ancient sources. The magical dimension of Renaissance Hermeticism, the idea that understanding cosmic correspondences allowed the practitioner to work wonders through natural magic, attracted particular attention from those who sought not merely to understand the world, but to manipulate it for practical purposes. Natural magic, as distinguished from demonic magic that involved invoking evil spirits, claimed to work through knowledge of the hidden properties of natural things and the sympathies and antipathies between different substances, celestial bodies, and spiritual forces, all operating within the created order according to laws established by God. The magus or wise magician was one who had mastered this knowledge and could use it to achieve effects that seemed miraculous to the ignorant but were actually applications of natural principles, no different in kind from the physician who healed disease through knowledge of herbs, or the astrologer who predicted events through knowledge of celestial influences. The Hermetic texts, with their teachings about how the higher influences the lower, and how the wise can work with these influences rather than being passively subject to them, provided philosophical justification for natural magic and practical instructions for operations like making talismans, invoking planetary spirits, and using images and symbols to channel celestial forces. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, a German polymath who lived in the first half of the 16th century, composed the most comprehensive and influential Renaissance treatise on magic, his 3 books of occult philosophy, which synthesized material from Hermetic texts, Neoplatonic philosophy, Kabbalistic sources, and medieval grimoires into a systematic presentation of magical theory and practice. Agrippa organized magic according to 3 worlds: the elemental world of physical substances and their properties, the celestial world of stars and planets and their influences, and the intellectual or divine world of angels and spiritual intelligences. And he explained how the magician could work at each of these levels through appropriate techniques. The first book dealt with natural magic, the use of stones, plants, animals, and other physical substances whose hidden virtues could be employed for magical purposes. The second book addressed celestial magic, the use of images, seals, and talismans created under appropriate astrological conditions to channel planetary influences. And the third book described religious or ceremonial magic, involving the invocation of angels and divine names to accomplish supernatural effects. Throughout the work, Agrippa cited Hermetic texts as authoritative sources, quoting the Emerald Tablet and other Hermetic writings to support his explanations of how magic operates and situating his own project within the tradition of ancient wisdom descending from Hermes Trismegistus. The practice of making talismans, which had existed in various forms throughout the medieval period, became more systematized and philosophically sophisticated in the Renaissance as practitioners drew on Hermetic principles to explain and refine their techniques. A talisman properly made was understood as a material object that had been brought into alignment with a particular celestial influence at the moment of that influence's greatest strength, capturing that influence in material form and making it available to the possessor of the talisman. The creation of such objects required knowledge of astrology to determine the favorable moments for the work, knowledge of the correspondences between planets and terrestrial substances to select appropriate materials, and knowledge of the proper symbols and images to inscribe on the talisman to specify and focus its power. A talisman of Venus, for example, might be made from copper on a Friday during an hour ruled by Venus, when Venus was strongly positioned in the sky, and it would bear images and characters associated with Venus drawn from various traditional sources, and it might be suffumigated with incenses pleasing to Venus, while prayers or invocations addressed to the planetary spirit were recited. The finished talisman would then serve to attract love, promote harmony, enhance beauty, or accomplish other effects associated with the influence of Venus. The question of whether such practices crossed the line from legitimate natural philosophy into prohibited trafficking with demons troubled both practitioners and ecclesiastical authorities, and the boundaries between acceptable and forbidden magic were debated throughout the Renaissance and early modern period. Some argued that any invocation of spiritual beings other than God and the approved angels was inherently demonic, that the planetary spirits addressed in talismanic magic were actually demons in disguise, and that attempting to control or command such beings was dangerous both spiritually and physically. Others maintained that the cosmos was genuinely inhabited by various orders of spiritual beings intermediate between God and humanity, that these beings were part of the natural order created by God, and that communicating with them was no more inherently sinful than communicating with other humans, provided one approached them with proper respect and did not ask them to perform evil acts. The ambiguous status of natural magic, neither clearly licit nor definitively forbidden in the eyes of most church authorities, allowed practice to continue even as debates about its legitimacy persisted, with individual practitioners making their own judgments about where to draw the line between acceptable and unacceptable operations. Giordano Bruno, a Dominican friar turned wandering philosopher who lived in the latter half of the 16th century, pushed Hermetic ideas in radical directions that ultimately contributed to his condemnation and execution by the Roman Inquisition, becoming one of the most controversial and tragic figures in the history of Renaissance philosophy. Bruno embraced a vision of an infinite universe containing countless worlds, a cosmos animated throughout by divine presence and offering humanity the possibility of transcending the limitations of earthly existence through philosophical contemplation and magical practice. He drew heavily on Hermetic texts in developing his philosophy, interpreting them as teaching that the universe was a living divine organism and that humans could become godlike through understanding and aligning themselves with cosmic forces. Bruno practiced and taught a form of memory magic based on creating mental images aligned with celestial patterns, a technique he believed would enhance intellectual power and open the mind to divine illumination, and he promoted a religious vision that minimized the distinctive claims of Christianity in favor of what he saw as a more universal and philosophically sophisticated Egyptian religion described in the Hermetic texts. His rejection of key Christian doctrines, his defense of controversial philosophical positions like the infinity of the universe and the plurality of worlds, and his criticism of established churches all contributed to his eventual arrest, trial, and execution in Rome in 1600, burned at the stake as an unrepentant heretic. The medical applications of Hermetic and alchemical thought found their most influential exponent in Paracelsus, a Swiss physician and alchemist who lived in the early 16th century and who revolutionized medical theory by rejecting the ancient humoral medicine of Galen in favor of an approach based on alchemical principles and observation of nature. Paracelsus argued that disease was caused by external agents that invaded the body, seeds of illness that could be countered by appropriate medicines, rather than by imbalances of the four humours as traditional medicine taught, and he advocated the use of chemically prepared medicines, tinctures and extracts created through alchemical procedures, rather than relying solely on plant materials in their natural forms. His approach to medicine was inseparable from his broader philosophical and spiritual vision, which drew heavily on Hermetic ideas about correspondence and cosmic unity, and he taught that the physician must understand the patient as a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm, that healing required addressing not just the physical symptoms, but the spiritual and cosmic dimensions of illness, and that the true physician was also an alchemist and a magus, one who understood the hidden connections between things and could work with natural forces to restore health. The Paracelsian medical tradition that developed after his death elaborated these ideas into comprehensive systems of chemical medicine that influenced the development of pharmacy and therapeutics across Europe. Even as academic physicians trained in traditional Galenic medicine often rejected Paracelsian innovations as dangerous innovation by an unlettered empiric. Paracelsian physicians established laboratories where they prepared chemical medicines, distilling plant and mineral substances to extract their active principles, creating novel compounds through alchemical procedures, and experimenting with dosages and combinations to discover what worked best for different conditions. The Paracelsian emphasis on observation and experiment, on testing ideas through practical trial, rather than relying solely on ancient authorities, contributed to the gradual transformation of medicine from a primarily theoretical discipline based on classical texts into a more empirical practice based on direct experience, though this transformation occurred slowly and unevenly over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. The theoretical framework within which Paracelsian physicians worked remained deeply influenced by Hermetic and alchemical ideas about cosmic correspondence and spiritual medicine, even as their practical work contributed to the development of chemistry and pharmacology as scientific disciplines. The 17th century brought profound changes to European intellectual life, changes that would gradually undermine the authority of Hermetic texts and transform the context within which esoteric knowledge was pursued and understood. The century opened with the authority of ancient texts still largely intact, with scholars continuing to believe that wisdom came primarily from recovering and correctly interpreting the writings of earlier ages, rather than from independent investigation of nature, but it closed with a new confidence in human reason and empirical observation as sources of knowledge potentially superior to any ancient authority. This transformation occurred gradually through the work of many individuals pursuing different paths of inquiry, and the old and new approaches coexisted for decades, with some scholars continuing to seek wisdom in Hermetic texts, even as others turned to telescopes and microscopes, to mathematical demonstration and controlled experiment as more reliable guides to understanding the natural world. The Hermetic tradition did not disappear, but rather lost its central position in learned discourse, becoming increasingly marginalized as what we now call modern science established itself as the authoritative way to investigate nature. The first major blow to Hermetic authority came from an unexpected direction, from the careful philological analysis of the Greek text of the Corpus Hermeticum by Isaac Casaubon, a Protestant scholar who approached the text not as revelations of ancient wisdom, but as historical documents that could be dated through attention to their language and content. Casaubon, working in the early years of the 17th century and publishing his findings in 1614, noted that the Greek of the Hermetic texts was not the Greek of ancient Egypt, but rather the Greek of the early Roman imperial period, that the philosophical ideas in the texts reflected concerns and influences of that later era rather than anything that could plausibly come from ancient Egypt, and that the text contained references to Greek philosophical concepts and terminology that had not existed in the time when the texts claimed to have been written. His conclusion, based on solid linguistic and historical evidence, was that the Hermetic texts were not the ancient Egyptian wisdom they purported to be, but rather compositions of the early Christian era, written by Greek-speaking authors who attributed their work to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus to give it authority. This redating of the text did not happen overnight, and many scholars initially resisted Casaubon's conclusions. But over the course of the 17th century, his arguments gained increasing acceptance, and the Hermetic texts lost their status as the most ancient philosophy, becoming instead interesting examples of late antique religious and philosophical syncretism. The impact of this redating on the status of Hermetic philosophy was significant, but not immediate or total, for even if the texts were not as ancient as previously believed, they still contained interesting ideas that some found valuable, and the question of a text's age was not the only measure of its worth. Some scholars continued to defend the essential antiquity of Hermetic wisdom, even if the specific texts now available were later compositions, arguing that these texts preserved genuine ancient Egyptian teachings even if the Greek versions dated from a later period, much as the Gospels preserved the teachings of Jesus even though they were written decades after his death. Others simply shifted their interest from the historical questions about when and where the texts were written to philosophical questions about what truth they might contain regardless of their origin, treating them as one voice in the conversation about the nature of reality and human destiny rather than as uniquely authoritative ancient revelations. The Hermetic texts continued to be printed, read, and cited throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, but their audience became more specialized, consisting increasingly of those already committed to esoteric traditions rather than the broader educated public that had been so enthusiastic about them in the Renaissance. The development of new methods for investigating nature, methods that emphasized direct observation, mathematical analysis, and experimental manipulation rather than interpretation of ancient texts, gradually created an alternative to the Hermetic approach to knowledge, one that proved more successful in generating reliable, cumulative understanding of natural phenomena. The astronomical observations of Galileo Galilei, conducted through his improved telescope in the early decades of the 17th century, revealed features of the heavens that no ancient text had described. Moons circling Jupiter, phases of Venus suggesting it orbited the Sun, mountains and craters on the Moon, spots on the Sun that appeared and disappeared, all phenomena that required new explanations rather than merely citing authority. The mathematical physics developed by Galileo and later by Isaac Newton provided ways to describe and predict the motions of bodies through space using equations and quantitative measurements, demonstrating that precise knowledge could be gained through mathematical reasoning applied to careful observations rather than through meditation on symbolic correspondences. These new approaches did not explicitly reject Hermetic principles, but simply bypassed them, showing that productive investigation of nature could proceed without reference to concepts like cosmic sympathy or the unity of macrocosm and microcosm. Isaac Newton, whose Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, published in 1687, established the framework that would dominate physics for the next 2 centuries, had himself deep interests in alchemy and theology that occupied much of his private study time, even as he pursued his revolutionary work in mathematics and physics. Newton studied alchemical texts carefully, conducted alchemical experiments in his laboratory, and filled notebooks with alchemical observations and speculations, seeking to understand the forces that held matter together and transformed one substance into another. Forces he believed operated through principles of attraction and repulsion that might be related to the gravitational attraction he had described in his physics. His alchemical work remained largely unpublished during his lifetime, and was dismissed or ignored by later generations of scientists who saw it as an embarrassing aberration in an otherwise rational career. But recent scholarship has recognized that Newton saw no sharp division between his physics and his alchemy, that both were part of a unified project to understand the fundamental principles governing the natural world, and that his concept of gravitational force acting at a distance may have been influenced by his alchemical thinking about occult virtues and hidden connections between bodies. The career of someone like Newton, who combined cutting-edge mathematical physics with serious study of alchemical and theological texts, illustrates how the transition from older to newer ways of investigating nature was not a simple rejection of everything that came before, but rather a complex process of sorting out what was productive from what was not, what led to reliable, testable knowledge from what remained speculative and contested. Other natural philosophers of the 17th century made similar combinations, pursuing mechanical philosophy that explained natural phenomena through the motions and collisions of particles, while also maintaining interests in alchemy, astrology, or other traditional esoteric practices. The Royal Society of London, founded in 1660 to promote experimental natural philosophy, included among its members both those who rejected all forms of magical thinking and those who continued to believe in the reality of transmutation and the validity of astrological influences, and debates about where to draw the line between legitimate natural philosophy and illegitimate occultism continued throughout the century as the boundaries of acceptable scientific inquiry were negotiated and renegotiated. The practice of alchemy underwent gradual transformation during the 17th century, as some practitioners began to separate the chemical operations from the mystical and spiritual interpretations that had previously been intertwined with them, focusing more narrowly on understanding and manipulating the material substances themselves without reference to cosmic correspondences or spiritual purification. This proto-chemistry, still called alchemy by its practitioners but increasingly distinct from the spiritual alchemy of earlier centuries, contributed to the development of new techniques for analyzing substances, new theories about the composition of matter, and new practical applications in medicine, metallurgy, and manufacturing. Chemists learned to identify substances by their reactions with other substances, to classify materials according to their properties and behaviors, and to predict what would happen when different substances were combined under specified conditions, gradually building up a body of reliable empirical knowledge about the material world, even as they continued to pursue the ultimate goals of transmutation and the philosopher's stone. The question of whether transmutation was really possible remained unsettled through much of the century, with some chemists maintaining it could be done and claiming to have witnessed successful transmutations, while others grew increasingly skeptical and suggested that the search for the philosopher's stone was misguided. The gradual decline of astrology as a practice taken seriously by educated elites proceeded alongside similar changes in how alchemy was regarded, as the accumulation of accurate astronomical observations and the development of new physics made the theoretical foundations of astrology seem increasingly questionable. If the planets were simply material bodies moving through space according to mathematical laws of motion and gravitation, as Newtonian physics suggested, then the notion that their positions influenced earthly events through some kind of spiritual or sympathetic connection became harder to maintain, at least for those who accepted the new physics. Astrology did not disappear, and popular almanacs containing astrological predictions continued to be published and widely read through the 18th century and beyond, but it increasingly lost status among learned natural philosophers who came to regard it as superstition rather than science. The transition was gradual and uneven, with some regions and some intellectual circles abandoning astrology earlier than others, and with individuals often maintaining selective skepticism, rejecting judicial astrology that claimed to predict specific events while accepting medical astrology that connected planetary influences to health and disease, or vice versa. The Rosicrucian manifestos that appeared in Germany in the early 17th century, anonymous pamphlets claiming the existence of a secret brotherhood possessing profound alchemical and magical knowledge, sparked enormous interest and controversy, attracting some who hoped to join this mysterious fraternity and drawing criticism from others who dismissed the whole thing as a hoax or a dangerous delusion. The manifestos, the Fama Fraternitatis, published in 1614, and the Confessio Fraternitatis, published in 1615, told the story of Christian Rosenkreuz, a German nobleman who supposedly travelled to the East in the 15th century, learned secret wisdom from Arab and Egyptian masters, returned to Germany to establish a brotherhood dedicated to healing the sick and reforming human knowledge, and whose tomb had recently been rediscovered containing his uncorrupted body and various books and instruments. The manifestos promised a general reformation of learning and society through the application of this ancient wisdom, criticized contemporary religion and philosophy for their errors and limitations, and invited worthy individuals to seek out the brotherhood and join in their work. Whether the Rosicrucian Brotherhood actually existed remained unclear, for no one seemed able to contact them despite many letters and publications addressed to them, and modern scholarship suggests the manifestos were probably a literary creation, perhaps intended to stimulate discussion and reform rather than to describe a real organization. The Rosicrucian excitement, whether based on a real organization or an elaborate fiction, tapped into widespread hopes for intellectual and spiritual renewal through recovery of ancient wisdom, and it stimulated the formation of actual esoteric societies and movements that drew on Hermetic, alchemical, and Kabbalistic traditions in their teachings and practices. These societies typically claim to possess secret knowledge passed down through chains of initiates from ancient times, organized themselves in grades or degrees through which members advanced as they demonstrated their understanding and worthiness, and practiced rituals designed to transmit spiritual illumination and transform consciousness. The boundary between what was claimed as historical fact about the origin and transmission of these traditions and what was mythological or symbolic representation of spiritual truths was often deliberately blurred, with the societies using legendary histories as teaching devices while not necessarily expecting members to believe them as literal historical accounts. The function of these societies was primarily educational and transformative, providing communities where individuals could pursue esoteric studies, practice rituals designed to affect spiritual development, and find fellowship with others engaged in similar seeking. Freemasonry emerged in the late 17th and early 18th centuries as one of the most successful and enduring of these esoteric societies, growing from the craft guilds of stonemasons into a fraternal organization that spread across Europe and eventually worldwide, attracting members from the educated and professional classes who were drawn to its combination of moral teaching, ritual practice, and claims to preserve ancient wisdom. Early Freemasonry drew relatively little on explicitly Hermetic sources, focusing more on the symbolism of the builder's craft and on moral allegory. But as the movement developed and diversified through the 18th century, some Masonic rites and degrees incorporated Hermetic, alchemical, and Kabbalistic elements, particularly in the higher degrees of systems like the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. The Masonic Lodge provided a space where men from different religious backgrounds, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish members, often meeting together despite the sectarian divisions of their time, could pursue philosophical and spiritual development through allegorical ritual and fraternal fellowship, and the movement's emphasis on religious tolerance, moral improvement, and the search for truth resonated with Enlightenment values, even as its esoteric elements preserved continuity with older mystical traditions. The relationship between Freemasonry and Hermeticism remained complex and contested, with some Masonic writers claiming that their rituals preserved the mysteries of ancient Egypt and that Hermes Trismegistus had been among the great teachers whose wisdom informed Masonic tradition, while others insisted that Masonry was purely a moral and social institution with no connection to magical or mystical practices. The diversity of Masonic rites and interpretations made both claims partially true, for Masonry encompassed many different approaches and attracted members with widely varying interests and beliefs, some primarily interested in the social and charitable aspects of the organization, while others sought deeper esoteric meanings in the symbols and rituals. The Hermetic principle as above, so below appeared in some Masonic contexts, interpreted as representing the correspondence between the moral order and the divine order, between the work of perfecting oneself and the work of aligning with cosmic harmony, and the alchemical metaphor of transformation from base metal to gold was sometimes invoked to describe the process of moral and spiritual development that Masonic initiation supposedly facilitated. The 18th century saw both the continued development of esoteric societies drawing on Hermetic and related traditions, and the increasing marginalization of these traditions in mainstream intellectual life, as the Enlightenment emphasis on reason, empirical observation, and public knowledge created a cultural climate less hospitable to claims of ancient secret wisdom accessible only to initiates. Enlightenment philosophers generally dismissed magic, alchemy, and astrology as superstitions to be overcome through education and the spread of rational thinking. And while they might find some value in the moral teachings of esoteric societies, they often criticized the secretive nature of such organizations and their claims to possess hidden knowledge as contrary to the ideals of transparency and universal education. The tension between esoteric and exoteric approaches to knowledge, between the idea that the deepest truths must be protected and transmitted only to the prepared few, and the idea that all truth should be publicly available to anyone with sufficient reason and education, shaped many debates in 18th century intellectual life, and continued to influence how Hermetic and related traditions were perceived and practiced. The 19th century witnessed a remarkable revival of interest in esoteric traditions, including Hermeticism, a revival that occurred not despite, but partly in reaction to the dominance of scientific materialism and the disenchantment of nature that accompanied the industrial age. As the mechanistic worldview of modern science became increasingly dominant in educated circles, describing nature as composed of inert matter moving according to mathematical laws with no intrinsic meaning or purpose, some individuals felt a profound dissatisfaction with this vision of reality and sought alternative frameworks that restored a sense of the sacred, the mysterious, and the meaningful to their understanding of existence. The Hermetic traditions, with their teachings about cosmic unity, hidden correspondences, and the spiritual potential of humanity, offered resources for those seeking to re-enchant the world, to find meaning and purpose in a universe that scientific materialism seemed to render cold and purposeless. The revival of Hermeticism in the 19th century was thus not a simple return to Renaissance or medieval ways of thinking, but rather a creative reinterpretation of those older traditions in light of modern concerns and sensibilities, blending ancient symbols with contemporary psychological and spiritual insights. The Romantic movement in literature and philosophy, which flourished in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, contributed to creating a cultural climate more receptive to esoteric ideas, emphasizing imagination, intuition, and subjective experience as sources of truth potentially superior to the calculating reason celebrated by Enlightenment thinkers. Romantic poets and philosophers criticized the reductionism of mechanical science, arguing that analyzing nature into its component parts and describing their interactions through mathematical equations missed something essential: the living unity and spiritual significance of the natural world that could be grasped only through aesthetic and mystical modes of perception. Some Romantic thinkers drew explicitly on Hermetic and alchemical symbolism, using the alchemical imagery of transformation and the Hermetic principle of correspondence to articulate their vision of nature as a living organism infused with spirit, a vision that contrasted sharply with the mechanistic cosmology of Newton and his successors. The Romantic fascination with the Middle Ages and with folk traditions also contributed to renewed interest in older forms of knowledge that the Enlightenment had dismissed as superstition, finding in them a wisdom and depth that modern rationalism had lost. The development of mesmerism and animal magnetism in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, practices based on the theory that a subtle magnetic fluid pervaded all nature and could be manipulated by trained practitioners to heal disease and influence consciousness, provided a seemingly scientific framework for understanding phenomena that Hermetic tradition had described in terms of astral influences and spiritual forces. Franz Anton Mesmer, the physician who gave his name to the movement, believed he had discovered a fundamental natural force that connected all things and could be directed through the will and gestures of the magnetizer to affect the magnetic fluid in patients' bodies, rebalancing their systems and curing ailments. Although mainstream medical science rejected Mesmer's theories and the Mesmerist movement was dismissed by many as quackery, it attracted enthusiastic followers who experienced dramatic effects from mesmeric treatments, and the practice spread across Europe and to America, where it became associated with other alternative healing methods and spiritual movements. The mesmerist seance, in which the magnetizer would induce a trance state in subjects who might then display clairvoyance or speak with altered voices claiming to be spirits, became a popular entertainment and a source of experiences that seemed to many to demonstrate the reality of spiritual dimensions beyond the material world that science studied. The spiritualist movement that emerged in the middle decades of the 19th century, claiming that the dead could communicate with the living through mediums who served as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds, further contributed to the revival of interest in occult and esoteric traditions. Spiritualism began in America in 1848 with the Fox sisters, who claimed to receive messages from spirits through mysterious rapping sounds in their home, and it quickly spread across America and to Europe, attracting millions of adherents who attended seances, witnessed phenomena like table tipping and spirit writing, and received messages they believed came from deceased loved ones. The spiritualist movement provided what seemed to many to be empirical evidence of survival after death and the existence of a spiritual dimension, challenging materialist philosophy through direct experience rather than abstract argument, and it created a cultural space within which other esoteric traditions could be taken seriously as offering genuine knowledge about hidden realities. Many spiritualists drew on Hermetic concepts in interpreting their experiences, understanding the spiritual world as interpenetrating the physical according to the principle as above so below, and seeing mediumship as a development of natural spiritual faculties that Hermetic tradition had described as latent in all humans. Eliphas Lévy, the pseudonym of Alphonse Louis Constant, a French occultist who published influential works on magic and esotericism in the 1850s and 60s, played a crucial role in reviving interest in Hermetic magic and presenting it to 19th century readers in a form that combined traditional symbolism with Romantic philosophy and contemporary spiritualist ideas. Lévy had trained for the Catholic priesthood before leaving the church and turning to the study of occultism, and his writings blended Christian mystical theology with Kabbalistic, alchemical, and Hermetic sources, presenting magic as a comprehensive science of the will that operated through understanding and manipulating the astral light, a concept he derived from mesmerist theories about magnetic fluid and identified with the universal agent described in Hermetic texts. His major works, including Dogma and Ritual of High Magic and the History of Magic, presented magic not as superstition, but as an ancient and legitimate form of knowledge that had been misunderstood and suppressed by both religious authorities and modern materialist science. And he argued that the revival of magical knowledge was necessary for human spiritual development and for the coming age that would transcend the limitations of both religious dogmatism and scientific reductionism. Levy's interpretation of magical practice emphasized the development of will and imagination as the primary tools of the magician, arguing that ritual implements, symbols, and invocations served primarily to focus the operator's consciousness and direct their will toward the desired effect, with the actual power coming from the trained mind rather than from external spirits or material objects. This psychologizing of magic, treating magical operations as primarily techniques for transforming consciousness and directing mental energies rather than as methods for commanding spirits or manipulating physical forces, would become increasingly common in later occultism, providing a way to take magical practice seriously while avoiding claims about supernatural causation that seemed incompatible with modern scientific understanding. Levy taught that the Emerald Tablet of Hermes contained in encrypted form the fundamental principles of all magical operation, and he wrote extensive commentaries on its brief phrases, interpreting them as instructions for spiritual development and magical practice that could be applied by the modern practitioner who understood their deeper meaning beneath the surface symbolism. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in London in 1888 by 3 Freemasons who claimed to have received authorization from mysterious continental adepts, became the most influential occult organization of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, developing an elaborate system of magical training based on synthesizing Hermetic, Kabbalistic, alchemical, and Rosicrucian traditions into a coherent curriculum organized in grades through which members advanced as they mastered the teachings and practices. The Golden Dawn system included instruction in the symbolism of the tarot, in astrological theory, in the Kabbalistic tree of life, as a map of consciousness and cosmology, in the construction and use of magical talismans, in methods of ritual magic for invoking spiritual forces, and in techniques of meditation and visualization for developing clairvoyant perception and spiritual awareness. The order attracted educated, accomplished individuals, including poets, artists, doctors, and other professionals who found in its teachings a framework for spiritual development and magical practice that seemed compatible with modern intellectual life, while offering access to experiences and knowledge excluded by mainstream culture. The Golden Dawn's emphasis on the Hermetic texts as foundational wisdom, on the principle of correspondence as the key to magical operation, and on spiritual transformation as the ultimate goal of magical practice, established patterns that would influence most subsequent Western occult movements. The rituals and teachings of the Golden Dawn drew heavily on the concept that the universe was structured according to a series of correspondences, with each element at one level of reality connected to corresponding elements at other levels, so that understanding these connections allowed the magician to work at one level to effect changes at another. The magical curriculum taught members to memorize elaborate tables of correspondences linking colors, numbers, Hebrew letters, tarot cards, astrological signs and planets, divine names, angels, elements, and countless other symbols into a comprehensive system in which everything had its proper place and its connections to everything else. This system was understood as reflecting the actual structure of reality, with the connections existing objectively in the fabric of creation rather than being merely human constructions, and magical operations worked by aligning oneself with these natural correspondences and using them to channel forces from higher levels of reality into manifestation on the physical plane. The elaborate detail of the Golden Dawn correspondence system represented an attempt to codify and systematize the Hermetic principle that the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, that human consciousness in its fully developed form contains within itself the pattern of the entire cosmos. The practice of ritual magic as taught in the Golden Dawn and similar orders involved creating a sacred space through ritual gestures and invocations, altering one's consciousness through meditation and visualization, and then performing specific operations designed to achieve particular results, whether spiritual development, divination, healing, or other goals. A typical ritual might begin with a banishing ceremony to clear the space of unwanted influences, proceed through invocations of divine names and angelic forces associated with the working's purpose, involve the visualization of complex symbolic imagery, including geometric forms and colors corresponding to the forces being invoked, and conclude with a grounding exercise to return the operator to ordinary consciousness. The effectiveness of such rituals was understood to depend not on the mechanical performance of prescribed actions, but on the operator's ability to fully engage imagination and will, to truly enter into the symbolic reality being created through the ritual and to align consciousness with the cosmic forces represented by the symbols. This required extensive training and practice, and the Golden Dawn curriculum was designed to provide that training systematically, beginning with basic exercises and gradually introducing more complex operations as members demonstrated their competence. The psychological interpretation of magical symbolism and practice became increasingly prominent in the early 20th century, particularly through the influence of depth psychology and the work of Carl Jung, who found in alchemical and hermetic symbols resources for understanding the unconscious dimensions of the psyche and the process of psychological development and individuation. Jung spent decades studying alchemical texts, recognizing in their descriptions of the alchemical process parallels to the psychological transformation that occurred in successful psychotherapy. The breaking down of old structures, the integration of unconscious contents into consciousness, and the emergence of a new, more integrated personality structure. He interpreted alchemical symbols like the union of sun and moon, king and queen, as representing the integration of opposite psychological functions and the reconciliation of conscious and unconscious aspects of personality. And he saw the alchemical goal of creating the philosopher's stone as symbolic of achieving psychological wholeness, what he called the self, the integrated totality of conscious and unconscious functioning. Jung's psychological interpretation of alchemy and Hermeticism provided a framework within which modern individuals could take these traditions seriously without necessarily believing in the literal possibility of transmuting lead into gold or in the objective existence of astral forces, instead understanding them as symbolic representations of psychological realities and processes of inner transformation. The influence of Jungian psychology on 20th century occultism was profound, providing a new language and conceptual framework for understanding esoteric practices and symbols, one that seemed compatible with modern scientific and psychological knowledge while preserving the transformative potential of engagement with traditional esoteric material. Many occultists adopted psychological interpretations of ritual and magical practice, understanding these activities as techniques for accessing and transforming the unconscious mind, for integrating shadow aspects of personality, for developing latent psychological capacities, and for achieving the psychological wholeness that Jung described as the goal of individuation. This psychological turn in occultism did not necessarily replace older metaphysical interpretations, but coexisted with them, with some practitioners understanding magical operations primarily in psychological terms, while others maintained belief in objective spiritual realities and forces that magical practice could contact and manipulate. The ambiguity allowed the esoteric traditions to remain relevant in a culture dominated by scientific and psychological frameworks, providing both psychological benefits through the transformative work with symbols and rituals, and maintaining the possibility of more metaphysical interpretations for those who found them meaningful. The publication and study of the Hermetic texts by academic scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries provided new historical and philological understanding of these works, while also making them more widely available to readers interested in them for philosophical or spiritual reasons rather than purely scholarly study. Editions with critical apparatus, translations into modern languages, and scholarly monographs examining the texts in their historical context gradually built up a body of academic knowledge about Hermeticism as a historical phenomenon, situating the texts within the religious and philosophical world of late antiquity and tracing their influence through medieval and Renaissance thought. This scholarly work generally proceeded independently of occult interest in the texts, with academic scholars often dismissive of contemporary esoteric movements that claim to practice Hermetic wisdom, but the scholarship made possible more informed engagement with the texts for those who approached them from within esoteric traditions, allowing them to distinguish what the texts actually said from later accretions and interpretations, while still finding in them resources for contemporary spiritual practice and philosophical reflection. The 20th century saw Hermetic ideas and symbols dispersing into increasingly diverse contexts, moving beyond the organized occult orders and learned philosophical treatises to influence literature, psychology, art, and eventually popular culture, often in forms quite removed from the original Hermetic texts, but still carrying traces of their core concepts about cosmic unity, hidden correspondences, and human spiritual potential. This diffusion occurred through multiple channels, through artists and writers who had studied with esoteric organizations or read occult literature and incorporated its symbols and themes into their creative work, through psychologists and therapists who drew on Jungian interpretations of esoteric symbolism in their clinical practice, through the counterculture movements of the 1960s and 70s that embraced alternative spirituality and rejected mainstream religious and scientific orthodoxies, and through the New Age movement that emerged in the latter decades of the century and brought esoteric concepts into mass-market books, workshops, and practices. The result was a complex layering of interpretations and applications of Hermetic ideas, ranging from serious scholarly study and disciplined spiritual practice to superficial appropriation of exotic symbols and catchphrases, with all gradations between these extremes represented in the diverse landscape of 20th century esotericism. The continuing influence of the Golden Dawn system, even after the organization itself had fragmented and its original structure had collapsed in the early years of the 20th century, persisted through the work of former members who established successor organizations, published books revealing previously secret teachings, and trained new generations of students in modified versions of the Golden Dawn curriculum. Israel Regardie, who had been secretary to the notorious occultist Aleister Crowley and had also worked with Golden Dawn materials, published comprehensive accounts of the Golden Dawn system in the 1930s and 40s, making available to a wide readership the rituals, correspondences, and teachings that had previously been accessible only to initiated members. This publication was controversial, with some occultists arguing that revealing mysteries to the uninitiated violated sacred oaths and would degrade the teachings by making them available to those unprepared to use them properly, while others maintained that the time had come for esoteric knowledge to be more widely shared, and that printed books could serve the same function as oral transmission in preserving and propagating valuable teachings. The controversy itself reflected changing attitudes about esoteric knowledge in the modern era, with older models of secret transmission through exclusive organizations increasingly giving way to more democratic approaches emphasizing individual access to spiritual teachings. Aleister Crowley, perhaps the most infamous and controversial figure in 20th century occultism, developed his own system of magical practice and spiritual philosophy called Thelema, drawing heavily on Golden Dawn teachings while rejecting what he saw as their Victorian prudishness and excessive structure, and he presented his work as the revelation of a new spiritual age that would supersede Christianity and other traditional religions. Crowley's writings on magic, yoga, mysticism, and philosophy incorporated extensive Hermetic material, including detailed commentaries on the Emerald Tablet and extensive use of correspondence systems, mapping consciousness and cosmic structures. But he reinterpreted these traditional elements through his own distinctive vision, emphasizing individual will, sexual mysticism, and radical freedom from conventional morality. His notoriety, stemming from his deliberately shocking behavior, his experiments with drugs and sexual magic, and his self-presentation as the beast prophesied in the Book of Revelation, made him a polarizing figure, reviled by many as a charlatan and degenerate, while admired by others as a genuine spiritual innovator and one of the most significant occult thinkers of his era. His extensive writings, published gradually over his lifetime and posthumously, influenced subsequent generations of occultists even when they rejected his more extreme teachings and practices. The Theosophical Society, founded in New York in 1875 by Helena Blavatsky and others, represented another important channel through which Hermetic and esoteric ideas reached wider audiences in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Theosophy presented itself as a synthesis of all esoteric traditions, claiming to preserve the ancient wisdom that supposedly underlay all religions and that had been passed down through secret brotherhoods of adepts who guided human spiritual evolution from behind the scenes. Blavatsky's major works, particularly The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, drew on Hermetic texts along with Buddhist, Hindu, Kabbalistic, and other sources in constructing an elaborate cosmology and spiritual anthropology that described the evolution of consciousness through multiple planes of existence and proclaimed that humanity was on the verge of a major evolutionary leap in spiritual development. The Theosophical Society attracted a substantial following, establishing lodges in cities around the world and publishing books and periodicals that reached thousands of readers interested in alternative spirituality. And while many of its specific claims about hidden masters and secret doctrines were regarded skeptically even by sympathetic observers, its role in introducing Eastern religious concepts to Western audiences and in creating networks of people interested in esoteric spirituality had lasting cultural impact. The interest in Eastern religions and philosophical traditions that accelerated through the 20th century, with increasing numbers of Westerners studying Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and other Asian traditions either through books or through direct contact with teachers from those traditions, created new contexts for understanding and practicing Hermetic ideas, as some practitioners sought to synthesize Western esoteric teachings with Eastern meditation practices, yoga, or concepts about consciousness and enlightenment. The discovery of apparent parallels between Hermetic teachings about cosmic unity and Buddhist doctrines of emptiness and interdependence, or between alchemical symbolism of transformation and yogic descriptions of spiritual awakening, led some to develop hybrid practices combining elements from different traditions. These syncretistic approaches were sometimes criticized as superficial or as distorting the distinct integrity of each tradition by forcing them into artificial correspondences, but they reflected genuine attempts by modern practitioners to integrate insights from multiple sources and to find common ground beneath the surface differences of cultural expression. The comparative study of mysticism and esoteric traditions that emerged as an academic field also contributed to this cross-cultural perspective, with scholars identifying recurring themes and patterns across different traditions while remaining attentive to their distinctive features and historical contexts. The use of psychedelic substances as tools for exploring consciousness and inducing mystical experiences became an important, if controversial, element of 20th century Western esotericism, particularly from the 1960s onward, when compounds like LSD became widely available and were enthusiastically embraced by segments of the counterculture as sacraments capable of revealing spiritual dimensions of reality ordinarily hidden from ordinary perception. Some who experimented with psychedelics found in their experiences confirmation of hermetic and mystical teachings about the unity of all existence, the illusory nature of the ego boundary, separating self from world, and the presence of dimensions of reality not accessible through ordinary sensory experience, and they interpreted their experiences through frameworks provided by esoteric traditions, including Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and Eastern religions. The connection between psychedelic experience and traditional esotericism was complex, with some arguing that the substances offered a shortcut to states of consciousness that esoteric training aimed to achieve through years of disciplined practice, while others maintained that drug-induced states, however impressive phenomenologically, lacked the integration and lasting transformation that came from genuine spiritual development through traditional methods. The widespread experimentation with psychedelics in the 60s and 70s contributed to a general opening toward alternative spirituality and questioning of materialist assumptions about consciousness and reality, helping to create the cultural climate in which interest in Hermetic and other esoteric traditions could flourish. The New Age movement that emerged in the 1970s and 80s brought esoteric concepts into mainstream popular culture through books, workshops, and practices that drew eclectically from multiple spiritual traditions, including Hermeticism, presenting teachings about consciousness, healing, personal transformation, and spiritual development in accessible language, stripped of the complex symbolism and rigorous training requirements of traditional esoteric schools. New Age teachers spoke about manifesting reality through focused intention, about the power of positive thinking, about healing through energy work, about channeling messages from spiritual guides, and about humanity's spiritual evolution into higher consciousness. Ideas that often echoed Hermetic teachings about the creative power of mind, the principle of correspondence, and the potential for spiritual development, but presented in simplified forms that could be easily consumed by mass audiences. Critics of the New Age movement argued that this popularization trivialized profound spiritual traditions, reducing them to techniques for achieving personal goals and ignoring their more challenging demands for moral transformation and disciplined practice, while defenders maintained that making these ideas accessible to wider audiences was valuable even if it meant simplifying complex teachings that many people benefited from New Age practices even if they did not pursue them with the depth and commitment that traditional esoteric training required. The concept of energy as a universal force underlying physical reality and accessible through various practices became particularly prominent in New Age discourse, serving as a contemporary translation of older esoteric concepts about astral light, magnetic fluid, or the universal agent described in Hermetic texts. New Age practitioners spoke about chakras and meridians, about clearing blocked energy and balancing energy flows, about raising vibrations and aligning with higher frequencies, using language that blended concepts from Indian yoga, Chinese medicine, and Western esotericism into a hybrid vocabulary that seemed to many to describe experiences they recognized from meditation, bodywork, or other practices. The scientific status of such energy concepts remained highly controversial, with mainstream scientists generally rejecting claims about subtle energies as inconsistent with known physics and explaining reported effects through psychological mechanisms like placebo responses and expectancy effects, while practitioners insisted that their direct experience confirmed the reality of energy phenomena even if current scientific frameworks could not yet account for them. The debate reflected broader tensions between experiential and empirical approaches to knowledge, between first-person phenomenology and third-person scientific observation as sources of reliable understanding. The development of transpersonal psychology as an academic subdiscipline in the 1960s and 70s, provided a more scholarly and clinically oriented context for exploring consciousness states and spiritual experiences that mainstream psychology had generally ignored or pathologized, drawing on both scientific research methods and insights from esoteric traditions to study meditation, mystical experiences, and non-ordinary states of consciousness. Transpersonal psychologists like Stanislav Grof, who had conducted extensive research with psychedelics in therapeutic settings, proposed models of consciousness that extended beyond the personal ego to include transpersonal dimensions, collective unconscious contents, and experiences of cosmic unity that resembled descriptions from mystical and esoteric traditions. This work legitimated serious investigation of phenomena that Hermetic and other esoteric traditions had long described, providing empirical data and theoretical frameworks that could engage with both scientific psychology and spiritual philosophies, though the field remained marginal within academic psychology and many of its claims remained controversial among mainstream researchers. The transpersonal movement demonstrated that some aspects of esoteric wisdom traditions could be investigated through scientific methods and integrated with contemporary psychological understanding without necessarily accepting all the metaphysical claims of those traditions. The continuing practice of ceremonial magic in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, carried on by various organizations, solitary practitioners, and informal groups, maintain direct links to the Hermetic tradition while also adapting it to contemporary contexts and sensibilities. Modern practitioners of Hermetic magic often combine traditional rituals and symbols drawn from sources like the Golden Dawn with contemporary psychological understanding, understanding magical operations as techniques for transforming consciousness and working with unconscious processes rather than as methods for compelling spiritual entities or directly manipulating physical causation through supernatural means. The practice typically involved creating elaborate rituals incorporating Hermetic symbolism, performing invocations of divine names and angelic forces drawn from Kabbalistic and Hermetic sources, using visualization and meditation techniques to enter altered states of consciousness, and recording experiences and results in magical diaries for later reflection and analysis. Some practitioners approached magic primarily as a form of applied depth psychology, a way of engaging with archetypal forces in the unconscious and directing them toward conscious goals, while others maintained more traditional metaphysical frameworks in which spiritual entities had objective existence and magical operations affected not just the practitioner's consciousness, but also external realities through subtle connections described by the Hermetic principle of correspondence. The internet and digital technologies that became widely available in the final decades of the 20th century and the early 21st century dramatically changed how esoteric knowledge was transmitted and practiced, making texts that had previously been rare and difficult to obtain freely available online, allowing practitioners from around the world to connect and share knowledge regardless of geographic distance, and enabling new forms of collaborative research and practice. Scanned versions of rare occult books and manuscripts appeared on websites and in digital libraries, translations of Hermetic texts were posted in multiple languages, and online forums provided spaces where people interested in esotericism could discuss texts, compare practices, and debate interpretations without needing to join formal organizations or travel to distant locations to meet teachers. This democratization of access to esoteric knowledge continued trends that had begun with print publication of previously secret teachings. But the scale and speed of information sharing through digital networks far exceeded what had been possible through books alone, creating both opportunities and challenges for esoteric traditions that had historically relied on personal transmission and gradual revelation of teachings as students demonstrated their readiness. The question of how to maintain the transformative power of esoteric practices and symbols in an age of information overload when anyone could download the complete Golden Dawn curriculum or read translations of Hermetic texts without any initiation or preparation, occupied many who valued these traditions and sought to preserve what they saw as essential. Some argued that mere access to information was not sufficient for genuine transformation, that the disciplines of meditation, ritual practice, and ethical development that traditionally accompanied study of esoteric teachings were what actually produced the benefits, and that these could not be conveyed through texts alone but required sustained practice over time, ideally guided by teachers with direct experience. Others suggested that the changed cultural context required new approaches to transmission that acknowledged contemporary patterns of learning and practice while still preserving the core insights and methods of the traditions, perhaps through online courses, video instruction, or virtual study groups that could provide some of the community support and graduated instruction that traditional lodges and mystery schools had offered. The tension between preserving tradition and adapting to contemporary circumstances, between maintaining standards and opening access, between protecting mysteries and sharing wisdom, reflected broader questions about how ancient spiritual teachings could remain vital and relevant in the modern world. The scholarly study of Hermeticism in the 20th and 21st centuries developed into a sophisticated field of historical and philosophical investigation, producing detailed analyses of the texts in their original languages, careful reconstructions of their historical contexts, and nuanced interpretations of their meanings within the religious and intellectual world of late antiquity. Academic scholars approached the Hermetic corpus not as revelations of timeless wisdom, but as historical documents that could illuminate the complex cultural exchanges occurring in the Mediterranean world during the early centuries of the Common Era, when Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Jewish theology, and early Christianity were all interacting and influencing one another in cities like Alexandria, where diverse populations lived together and ideas crossed cultural boundaries with relative ease. This scholarly work required mastery of ancient languages, including Greek, Coptic, Latin, and sometimes Arabic, familiarity with the broader context of late antique philosophy and religion, and careful attention to the specific features of individual texts rather than treating the Hermetic corpus as a uniform body of doctrine. The result was a much more historically grounded understanding of what these texts actually said and what they meant to their original audiences, even if this scholarly understanding often differed significantly from how later esoteric movements had interpreted and used the same texts. The discovery and publication of additional Hermetic texts in the 20th century, particularly the Coptic Hermetic writings found among the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt in 1945, provided new material for scholarly study and complicated the picture of what Hermeticism had been in antiquity. The Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of Coptic manuscripts buried in a jar near an ancient Christian monastery, contained primarily Gnostic Christian texts, but also included several Hermetic treatises, some previously unknown, and others representing different versions of texts already known from the Greek Corpus Hermeticum. These Coptic Hermetic texts, translated from Greek originals now lost, provided evidence that Hermetic ideas had circulated in Christian Egypt and had been valued sufficiently by some Egyptian Christians to be copied and preserved alongside their sacred scriptures. The presence of these texts in a Christian monastic library raised questions about how Egyptian Christians had understood and used Hermetic teachings, whether they saw them as compatible with Christianity or as alternative revelations, and what relationship existed between Hermetic philosophy and the various Gnostic movements that flourished in the same time and place. The relationship between Hermeticism and Gnosticism, two overlapping but distinct currents in late antique religious thought, became a major topic of scholarly investigation, with researchers debating whether Hermetic texts should be classified as Gnostic, whether they represented an independent philosophical movement that shared some themes with Gnosticism, or whether the category of Gnosticism itself was too broad and imprecise to be useful in understanding the diversity of religious movements in the period. Gnosticism, as scholars use the term, generally refers to religious movements that emphasize salvation through special knowledge, that taught a radical dualism between the spiritual and material realms, that portrayed the material world as the creation of an inferior or ignorant deity rather than the true supreme God, and that offered mythological accounts of how sparks of divine spirit became trapped in matter and how they could be liberated through gnosis. The philosophical Hermetic texts shared some of these themes, particularly the emphasis on knowledge as the path to salvation, and the idea that humans possess divine nature despite their embodiment in matter, but they generally lack the radical anti-cosmic dualism and the complex mythological narratives characteristic of Gnostic systems, presenting the material world as good though inferior to the spiritual realm rather than as fundamentally evil or illusory. The social context in which Hermetic texts were produced and used remains somewhat mysterious despite scholarly investigation, for the texts themselves provide little direct evidence about the communities or individuals who created and studied them. Unlike early Christian texts that often contain information about church organization, leadership structures, and community practices, or like philosophical school texts that reference specific teachers and institutional settings, the Hermetic texts generally present themselves as dialogues between Hermes and his students without situating these conversations in any concrete social context. Scholars have suggested various possibilities that the texts were produced by loosely organized circles of philosophical seekers who met informally to discuss spiritual matters, that they emerged from Egyptian priestly communities adapting to the Hellenistic world by presenting their traditions in Greek philosophical language, that they were literary creations by individual authors working within established philosophical genres, or that they served as instructional texts for mystery cult initiations about which we have little direct information. The lack of clear evidence means that scholars must work largely through inference from the texts themselves and from what is known about similar movements and institutions in the period, reconstructing plausible scenarios rather than documenting definite facts about Hermetic social organization. The question of Egyptian influence on the Hermetic texts, the extent to which they genuinely preserved or adapted Egyptian religious ideas versus simply attributing Greek philosophical concepts to an Egyptian god for cultural prestige, has generated considerable scholarly debate and diverse conclusions. Some scholars have argued that beneath the Greek philosophical language of the texts lies genuine Egyptian religious thought, pointing to concepts that seem to reflect Egyptian cosmology, to the attribution of the texts to Thoth, who was a genuinely important Egyptian deity, and to evidence that educated Egyptians in the Hellenistic period did adapt their traditional religious ideas to Greek forms of expression. Others have maintained that the texts are essentially Greek philosophy with only superficial Egyptian colouring, that their philosophical content derives primarily from Platonism and Stoicism, with little that cannot be explained through Greek sources, and that the Egyptian attributions served primarily as a rhetorical strategy to claim ancient authority rather than reflecting actual transmission of Egyptian priestly wisdom. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes, with the texts representing a genuine fusion of Egyptian and Greek elements in which Egyptian religious concepts about the divine, creation, and the afterlife were articulated through Greek philosophical vocabulary and methods of argumentation, creating something that was neither purely Egyptian nor purely Greek, but rather a distinctively Hellenistic hybrid. The technical Hermetic texts dealing with astrology, alchemy, and magic presented different interpretive challenges for scholars, who had to understand these practices in their original contexts rather than judging them by modern scientific standards or dismissing them as mere superstition. Scholars of ancient science and medicine recognized that astrology and alchemy, as practiced in antiquity, were serious intellectual endeavors, attempts to understand and work with natural phenomena that drew on careful observation, systematic theorizing, and accumulated practical experience, even if their basic assumptions about how nature worked differed from modern scientific understanding. Ancient astrology was not simply fortune-telling, but rather a comprehensive cosmological system that integrated astronomy, mathematics, medicine, psychology, and religious ideas into a framework for understanding how celestial and terrestrial phenomena were connected. And ancient alchemy involved genuine chemical operations and observations of material transformations, even as it interpreted these processes through theories about spiritual and cosmic principles. Understanding these practices in their own terms, as coherent systems of thought and practice that made sense within their cultural contexts, became an important goal of historical scholarship, one that required scholars to bracket their own assumptions about what counted as legitimate knowledge and to take seriously worldviews quite different from modern scientific naturalism. The influence of Hermetic texts on medieval and Renaissance thought, traced through careful examination of citations, manuscript traditions, and conceptual borrowings, revealed how central these works had been to European intellectual history, even though they were no longer read as authoritative sources by most educated people in the modern period. Scholars documented how Hermetic ideas had shaped Renaissance philosophy, how they had influenced the development of alchemy and natural magic, how they had contributed to debates about the relationship between ancient wisdom and Christian revelation, and how their eventual discrediting as genuinely ancient texts had affected the credibility of esoteric traditions more broadly. This historical work demonstrated that the Hermetic texts, whatever their actual origin and date, had played a significant role in European cultural and intellectual development, and that understanding Renaissance thought in particular required taking seriously the impact of Hermeticism, even if modern scholars no longer shared Renaissance assumptions about the text's antiquity and authority. The study of how texts were received and used in different historical periods, how they were interpreted and reinterpreted to serve new purposes, became as important as establishing what they originally meant, for the history of interpretation was itself an important part of cultural history. The relationship between Hermetic philosophy and early Christianity attracted scholarly attention both because of the parallels between some Hermetic teachings and Christian doctrines, and because of evidence that some early Christians had read and valued Hermetic texts. The Hermetic emphasis on the word through which creation occurred, the description of spiritual rebirth through divine illumination, the teaching that the Son of God dwelt within humanity, and other themes seem to early Christian readers like Lactantius and Augustine to anticipate Christian revelation, and some saw in Hermetic texts evidence that pagan philosophers had glimpsed Christian truths through natural reason, or even that they had been influenced by contact with Jewish or Christian sources. Modern scholars generally viewed these parallels differently, not as evidence of Christian influence on Hermeticism or vice versa, but rather as showing that both drew on common sources in Hellenistic philosophy and that both were addressing similar existential and religious concerns in the cultural context of the Roman Empire. The idea of salvation through knowledge, the distinction between the divine and material realms, the possibility of achieving divine status through spiritual development, and other themes found in both Hermetic and Christian texts reflected wider patterns in late antique religious thought rather than direct borrowing in either direction. The study of Hermetic influence on Islamic philosophy and science revealed another chapter in the transmission and transformation of these texts, showing how Arabic translations had preserved Hermetic material and how Islamic thinkers had incorporated Hermetic ideas into their own philosophical, alchemical, and mystical traditions. Scholars examined Arabic manuscripts of Hermetic texts, some of which preserved versions that differed from the Greek originals or included material not found in extant Greek sources, and they traced how Islamic philosophers like Ibn Sina and Suhrawardi had engaged with Hermetic ideas in developing their own philosophical systems. the identification of Hermes with the prophet Idris in Islamic tradition, the development of Arabic alchemy drawing on Hermetic principles, and the incorporation of Hermetic astrology into Islamic astronomy all demonstrated how thoroughly these texts had been integrated into medieval Islamic intellectual culture. The subsequent transmission of Hermetic texts from Arabic back into Latin in the medieval West, sometimes producing versions that differed from the Greek originals because they had passed through Arabic intermediaries, illustrated the complex pathways by which knowledge moved across cultures and languages in the medieval Mediterranean world. The question of what value Hermetic texts might hold for contemporary readers, beyond their historical interest as documents illuminating late antique thought, prompted various responses from scholars, with some maintaining strict historical distance and treating the texts purely as objects of study, while others suggested that engaging philosophically with the ideas expressed in these texts could still be rewarding, even if one did not accept them as revelations of ancient wisdom. The Hermetic vision of cosmic unity, the emphasis on the dignity and spiritual potential of humanity, the call to pursue wisdom through contemplation and self-knowledge, and other themes in the texts addressed perennial human concerns and could be appreciated as philosophical positions worthy of consideration regardless of when or why they were written. Some contemporary philosophers of religion and scholars of mysticism argued that the Hermetic texts offered resources for thinking about the relationship between the divine and the created world, about the nature and possibilities of religious experience, and about how ancient religious and philosophical traditions might speak to contemporary spiritual seekers, though they emphasized that such engagement should be informed by historical understanding rather than based on outdated assumptions about the text's origin and authority. The continued practice of Hermeticist spirituality and magic in the contemporary world, informed now by scholarly understanding of what the ancient texts actually said and meant, but still seeking to draw on them as resources for spiritual development and ritual practice, represented another way that these ancient texts remained living traditions rather than merely historical artifacts. Some contemporary Hermeticists approached the texts with awareness that they were not ancient Egyptian wisdom, but products of the Hellenistic period. Yet they found value in working with the philosophical and spiritual teachings the texts contained, understanding them as one articulation among many of perennial mystical insights about the nature of consciousness, divinity, and the path to spiritual realization. Others focused on the ritual and magical dimensions of the Hermetic tradition, practicing forms of ceremonial magic based on Renaissance and modern interpretations of Hermetic principles, while acknowledging the historical development and transformation of these practices over time. The relationship between historical scholarship and living practice remained complex, with practitioners sometimes resistant to scholarly findings that seemed to undermine the authority or authenticity of their traditions, but increasingly a more sophisticated engagement developed in which practitioners could appreciate scholarly insights while still maintaining the practices as meaningful spiritual disciplines. The broader cultural influence of Hermetic ideas in contemporary Western culture, often mediated through popularizations that simplified and transformed the original concepts, could be traced in various domains from self-help literature emphasizing the power of thought to create reality, to holistic health practices based on ideas about energy and correspondence, to business and management theories about organizational culture and systems thinking that unconsciously echoed Hermetic ideas about interconnection and the correspondence between different levels of organization. The phrase "as above, so below" had become a cultural commonplace, often used without awareness of its Hermetic origin, to express ideas about how patterns at one level of reality reflect patterns at other levels, and concepts derived from Hermetic principles about the creative power of mind and the spiritual dimensions of material existence circulated widely in contemporary culture, even when disconnected from their historical sources. This diffusion of Hermetic ideas in diluted and transformed versions raised questions about cultural transmission and transformation, about how concepts moved from their original contexts into new settings where they took on different meanings and functions, and about what, if anything, remained of the original insight or practice when it had been so thoroughly adapted to new circumstances and audiences. The enduring appeal of Hermetic texts and ideas across so many centuries and diverse cultural contexts points to something in their core themes that resonates with fundamental human concerns and aspirations, questions about meaning and purpose, about the relationship between humanity and the cosmos, about the possibility of transcending ordinary limitations through knowledge and spiritual development. The Hermetic vision of a cosmos that is not merely mechanical but meaningful, not dead matter in motion but alive with intelligence and purpose, offered an alternative to materialist philosophies that seem to many to drain the world of significance and reduce human existence to a brief, accidental phenomenon in an indifferent universe. The teaching that humans possess divine nature, that consciousness is not merely an epiphenomenon of brain chemistry, but participates in the divine mind that creates and sustains reality, provided a framework for understanding human dignity and potential that contrasted sharply with reductionist views of mind and self. These themes spoke to perennial human longings for connection with something greater than the individual ego, for understanding one's place in the larger scheme of things, for hope that life has meaning and that spiritual development is possible. The concept of correspondence, the idea that different levels of reality mirror and influence one another according to patterns that the wise can learn to perceive and work with, offered a way of seeing unity and connection beneath the apparent diversity and separation of phenomena. This principle suggested that nothing exists in isolation, that everything and every event is related to everything else through networks of similarity and sympathy, and that understanding these relationships allows one to see more deeply into the nature of reality and to act more effectively in harmony with cosmic patterns. In Hermetic thought, the correspondences were not arbitrary associations, but reflected the actual structure of creation, the way that the divine mind had organized reality so that each level from the highest spiritual realms down to the lowest material manifestations reflected the same fundamental patterns in forms appropriate to each level. Learning to see these patterns, to recognize how the macrocosm was reflected in the microcosm, how celestial motions corresponded to terrestrial events, how psychological states related to physical conditions became the foundation of both theoretical understanding and practical application of Hermetic wisdom. The emphasis on knowledge as transformative rather than merely informative distinguished the Hermetic approach from both ordinary learning and from religious salvation schemes based primarily on faith or ritual observance. The gnosis that Hermetic texts described was not intellectual understanding that left the knower unchanged, but rather a direct experiential knowing that transformed consciousness and being simultaneously, a revelation of one's true nature as divine, rather than merely mortal, that could not leave one the same as before. This transformative knowledge was described in the Hermetic texts as a kind of rebirth, a death of the old self identified with the body and its passions, and a birth of a new self conscious of its divine nature and no longer bound by material limitations. The process of achieving this knowledge required not just study, but also moral purification, contemplative practice, and a fundamental reorientation of values away from worldly concerns towards spiritual realities, making it a demanding path that not everyone was willing or able to undertake. The texts acknowledged that many would remain attached to the pleasures and concerns of bodily existence, that the path of wisdom attracted only a few, and that those few who pursued it would often find themselves at odds with the values and priorities of the larger society. The Hermetic understanding of the relationship between the divine and the created world avoided both the extreme transcendence that placed God utterly beyond creation, with no real connection to it, and the pantheistic identification that made God and world simply equivalent, instead presenting a view in which the divine was both immanent in creation, present in every part of it, and transcendent beyond it, maintaining a distinction between creator and created while insisting on their intimate connection. This both and, rather than either or approach to theological questions was characteristic of Hermetic thought more generally, which tended to embrace paradox and to present truth as existing in the tension between opposites rather than in one pole or the other. God was described as both unity and plurality, as beyond all qualities yet containing all qualities, as unchanging yet the source of all change, and humans were described as both mortal and divine, both earthly and heavenly, both bound and free. These paradoxes were not seen as logical contradictions to be resolved through choosing one side, but as accurate descriptions of realities too complex to be captured by simple formulations, mysteries to be contemplated rather than problems to be solved through analysis. The practice of contemplation, the sustained meditation on divine realities and spiritual truths, occupied a central place in Hermetic spirituality as the means by which the mind could be gradually transformed and opened to higher knowledge. Contemplative practice evolved withdrawing attention from external sensory stimuli and from the stream of ordinary thoughts and concerns, focusing instead on philosophical and theological themes, on symbols and images that pointed towards spiritual realities, on questions about the nature of the divine and the path to union with it. Through repeated practice, the contemplative would ideally experience moments of illumination in which the teachings were no longer merely concepts to be thought about, but living realities directly perceived. Moments in which the separation between knower and known dissolved, and one experienced unity with the divine ground of being. These experiences were described in the Hermetic texts as gifts of divine grace that could not be forced or manufactured through technique alone. Yet the texts also insisted that preparation through study and moral purification made one receptive to such grace that divine illumination came to those who had readied themselves to receive it through dedicated practice and virtuous living. The ethical dimension of Hermetic teaching, though less emphasized in the texts than the cosmological and spiritual doctrines, nonetheless provided important guidance for how the seeker should live while pursuing wisdom, and how the attainment of wisdom should transform one's relationship to others and to the world. The texts counseled detachment from worldly goods and pleasures, not out of ascetic rejection of the body or material creation, which were understood as good in their proper place, but because excessive attachment to transient things distracted from the pursuit of eternal truths and bound the soul to the cycle of birth and death. Moderation in bodily pleasures, cultivation of virtue, honesty in dealings with others, and compassion toward all beings were enjoined as naturally following from understanding the divine nature of all humans and the unity of creation. The wise person who had achieved gnosis was expected to live in the world but not be of it, to fulfill necessary social obligations while maintaining inner freedom, to use wealth and power if possessed, but without being corrupted by them, and to help others along the path to wisdom when opportunities arose while recognizing that each person must ultimately walk their own path. The cosmological teachings of the Hermetic texts, describing the structure of reality as a series of levels or planes descending from pure divine unity through increasingly dense and material realms down to the physical world, provided a map for understanding both the nature of existence and the path of spiritual ascent. These levels were typically associated with the 7 visible planets, plus the fixed stars and the realm beyond the stars, where pure spiritual realities dwelt, creating a hierarchy that was simultaneously cosmological, describing the actual structure of the universe, and psychological, describing levels of consciousness from ordinary material awareness through successively more refined states up to mystical union with the divine. The soul's journey through these levels during incarnation taking on qualities and limitations associated with each planetary sphere as it descended into material embodiment, explained how divine spirit became entangled with matter and passion, while the possibility of ascending back through those same levels through spiritual practice explained how liberation could be achieved. This cosmological scheme influenced medieval and Renaissance astrology, alchemy, and magic, providing the theoretical framework within which these practices operated and interpreting their operations as working with the forces and qualities associated with different levels of the cosmic hierarchy. The use of symbols and imagery in Hermetic texts, drawing on mythological figures, natural phenomena, geometric forms, and other elements to convey spiritual truths that could not be adequately expressed in literal language, reflected a view that the highest realities could only be approached indirectly through metaphor and analogy rather than captured in precise definitions. The text used symbols like light and darkness, father and mother, king and queen, sun and moon, gold and silver, each carrying multiple layers of meaning that operated simultaneously at cosmological, psychological, and spiritual levels, and the reader was expected to meditate on these symbols and discover their meanings through contemplation rather than through logical analysis. This symbolic mode of communication was intentional, based on the understanding that the deepest truths are not objects that can be grasped intellectually, but realities that must be experienced directly, and that symbols could evoke recognition of those realities in someone prepared to receive them while remaining merely decorative or puzzling to those not yet ready. The obscurity of much Hermetic writing was thus not accidental or a failure of communication, but rather a deliberate pedagogical strategy, protecting sacred knowledge from profanation while guiding serious seekers toward genuine understanding. The relationship between individual and universal in Hermetic thought, the teaching that the human microcosm contained within itself the pattern of the macrocosm, and that therefore self-knowledge was the path to knowledge of all things, suggested a method of investigation and discovery quite different from the external observation and measurement that characterized modern science. If the cosmos was truly reflected in the human being, then turning attention inward through introspection and contemplation could reveal truths about the structure of reality, not just about one's personal psychology, but about universal principles that governed all existence. This introspective method was not meant to replace observation of the external world, but to complement it, providing access to dimensions of reality not available through the physical senses, and the integration of inner and outer knowledge was understood as necessary for complete wisdom. The Hermetic path thus involved both study of nature, observing the patterns of celestial motion and terrestrial cycles, and study of consciousness through meditation and self-observation, with insights from each domain illuminating and confirming insights from the other. The concept of the divine as mind or nous, the creative intelligence that generates and sustains all reality through thought, provided the foundation for Hermetic metaphysics and explained both the origin of the cosmos and the possibility of human knowledge of divine realities. If the universe was essentially mental, the thought of God made manifest in material forms, then the human mind which participated in the divine mind could in principle comprehend the patterns according to which creation was ordered, for it would be recognizing in external phenomena the same principles that operated within consciousness itself. This idealist metaphysics contrasted with materialist views that treated mind as derivative from matter and suggested instead that matter was derivative from mind, that physical forms were crystallizations or condensations of mental patterns, and that therefore the deepest understanding of nature required grasping the ideas that physical phenomena embodied rather than merely describing their observable properties. The Hermetic teaching that God created through the Word, through speaking reality into existence, echoed this same principle, for words are expressions of thought, and the divine word was understood as the creative power of divine thought articulating itself in the multiplicity of creation. The promise of spiritual transformation and the possibility of achieving divine status through wisdom and practice gave Hermetic teaching its practical urgency and existential significance, elevating it beyond mere philosophical speculation about the nature of reality to a path that offered liberation from suffering and mortality. The texts described the transformed sage as no longer subject to fate, no longer bound by the astrological influences and karmic patterns that determined the lives of ordinary people who remained ignorant of their true nature, and as possessing powers over nature that seemed magical to the uninitiated, but were actually expressions of working in harmony with cosmic law. Whether these claims should be understood literally or metaphorically, as describing actual supernatural abilities or as symbolic representations of psychological and spiritual freedom, became a matter of interpretation, but the core promise remained the same, that through dedication to the Hermetic path, one could transcend ordinary human limitations and realize one's divine potential. This promise attracted seekers across the centuries who found in Hermetic texts hope that human existence need not be limited to material concerns and biological imperatives, that consciousness could expand beyond its ordinary bounds, and that wisdom was not merely theoretical knowledge, but a transformative power. The integration of philosophy, religion, and practical techniques in Hermetic tradition created a comprehensive system addressing theoretical questions about the nature of reality, existential questions about meaning and purpose, and practical questions about how to live and how to achieve spiritual development. This integration appealed to those who found purely philosophical approaches too abstract and disconnected from lived experience, purely religious approaches too dependent on faith and external authority, and purely practical approaches too limited to technique without deeper understanding. The Hermetic path offered a way to engage head, heart, and hand together, to satisfy intellectual curiosity through philosophical study, to fulfill spiritual longing through contemplation and mystical experience, and to express understanding through ritual practice and ethical living. This holistic approach recognized that humans are complex beings with multiple dimensions and needs, that genuine transformation must engage the whole person rather than only the intellect or only the emotions, and that theory and practice must support and inform each other rather than being pursued separately. The long journey of the Hermetic texts and the traditions they inspired, from their composition in the early centuries of the Common Era through their transmission across cultures and languages, their rise to prominence in Renaissance thought, their gradual marginalization in the age of modern science, and their continued influence in various forms down to the present day, reveals much about how ideas travel through time and transform in response to changing cultural contexts. These texts were never static, never simply transmitted unchanged from generation to generation, but were constantly being reinterpreted, adapted, translated not just between languages, but between worldviews, and put to new uses by readers who brought their own concerns and assumptions to the encounter. The Hermetic corpus that Renaissance scholars read was already different from what late antique philosophers had studied, filtered through Arabic translations and medieval Latin renderings, and the Hermeticism practiced by modern occultists differs again from Renaissance interpretations, informed now by psychology, comparative religion, and historical scholarship. Yet through all these transformations, certain core themes persisted: the emphasis on cosmic unity and correspondence, the view of humanity as microcosm, the path of wisdom as transformative knowledge, suggesting that these ideas address something fundamental in human experience that remained relevant across vast differences in time and culture. The question of authenticity, whether the Hermetic text genuinely preserved ancient Egyptian wisdom, as Renaissance scholars believed, or were Hellenistic compositions as modern scholarship demonstrated, raises deeper questions about what makes a spiritual or philosophical tradition valuable and authoritative. If the worth of a teaching depends on its antiquity, then the discrediting of Hermetic texts as not truly ancient undermines their authority and reduces them to historical curiosities. But if the worth of a teaching depends on the truth and value of what it says, then questions of authorship and date become less central than questions about whether engaging with these ideas enriches understanding and supports spiritual development. The Hermetic texts, whatever their origin, articulated a coherent vision of reality and a practical path of transformation that many people across many centuries found meaningful and helpful, and that pragmatic validation might be more important than historical pedigree. The tendency to seek ancient sources for spiritual teachings, to believe that older necessarily means wiser, and that the earliest formulations of an idea are the most authentic, perhaps reflects a longing for stable foundations in a changing world. But it may also obscure the ways that traditions actually develop through creative adaptation, and that later formulations can genuinely improve on earlier ones. The role of secrecy and initiation in esoteric traditions, the idea that the highest teachings must be protected from the unprepared and revealed only gradually as students demonstrate their readiness, reflects assumptions about knowledge and pedagogy quite different from modern educational ideals of universal access and transparent communication. The esoteric view holds that certain truths can be harmful if encountered prematurely. That understanding depends not just on receiving information, but on developing the consciousness capable of grasping it, and that therefore teaching must be tailored to the student's level of development, rather than simply presenting all knowledge equally to everyone. This approach contrasts with the Enlightenment ideal of bringing all knowledge into public light, making it available to anyone with sufficient reason and education, and with modern democratic values emphasizing equal access to information. The tension between these views continues in contemporary discussions about who should have access to powerful technologies, whether there are forms of knowledge that require special preparation or regulation, and how to balance the benefits of open information sharing with the risks of misuse by those who lack appropriate context and ethical grounding. The transformation of alchemy from a literal practice aimed at transmuting metals into a metaphor for psychological and spiritual transformation illustrates a broader pattern in how esoteric traditions adapt to modern contexts by shifting from literal to symbolic interpretations. When the literal claims of a tradition become untenable in light of scientific understanding, as the possibility of transmuting lead into gold through pre-modern chemical procedures became increasingly implausible with advances in chemistry and physics, practitioners and interpreters have two main options: to abandon the tradition entirely as based on mistaken premises, or to reinterpret it symbolically as expressing psychological or spiritual truths through material metaphors. The psychological interpretation of alchemy, pioneered by Jung and adopted by many modern Hermeticists, exemplifies this second approach, finding new value in old texts by reading them as describing inner rather than outer transformations, as guides to individuation rather than recipes for making gold. This hermeneutical move allows traditions to survive the debunking of their literal claims while preserving what interpreters see as their deeper wisdom, though critics argue that such reinterpretations sometimes read meanings into texts that their original authors did not intend, and that the resulting interpretations, however valuable, represent new creations rather than recoveries of ancient wisdom. The influence of Hermetic ideas on the development of modern thought extended beyond the obvious realms of occultism and alternative spirituality to touch mainstream philosophy, science, and culture in ways that are sometimes overlooked. The Renaissance emphasis on human dignity and potential, so central to the development of humanism, drew support from Hermetic teachings about the divine nature of humanity, and the concept of natural magic influenced early modern science's conviction that nature operated according to intelligible principles that human reason could discover and even manipulate. The Romantic reaction against Enlightenment rationalism drew on Hermetic and alchemical symbolism to articulate visions of nature as organic and meaningful rather than mechanical and purposeless. And depth psychology's exploration of the unconscious incorporated alchemical symbolism and Hermetic concepts in theorizing about psychological transformation. Even contemporary systems theory and ecology, with their emphasis on interconnection and feedback loops, echo in secular scientific language the Hermetic principle that all parts of the cosmos are related and mutually influential, suggesting that insights first articulated in mystical and esoteric contexts can find new expression in scientific frameworks when the cultural context is receptive. The persistence of interest in Hermetic and esoteric traditions, despite their marginalization by mainstream science and philosophy, suggests that these traditions address needs and concerns that dominant intellectual paradigms do not fully satisfy. For some, the appeal lies in the promise of direct experiential knowledge of spiritual realities, rather than having to accept religious doctrines on faith or philosophical arguments on logical grounds. The offer of techniques and practices through which one can investigate consciousness and reality for oneself. For others, the attraction is the sense of meaning and purpose that esoteric worldviews provide. The vision of a cosmos that is not indifferent to human existence, but is rather infused with intelligence and structured according to patterns that the human mind can comprehend because it participates in the cosmic mind. Still others are drawn to the aesthetic dimension of esoteric symbols and rituals, the rich imagery and dramatic ceremonies that engage imagination and emotion as well as intellect, providing experiences of beauty and mystery often absent from more rationalist approaches to knowledge. These various appeals explain why esoteric traditions continue to attract adherents and generate new expressions even in a culture dominated by scientific and technological ways of thinking. The relationship between science and esotericism, sometimes presented as simple opposition between reason and superstition, turns out on closer examination to be more complex and historically entangled than such binary framing suggests. Many figures who contributed to the development of modern science, including Newton, Boyle, and others, were deeply interested in alchemy and other esoteric practices, and their scientific work was not separate from, but interwoven with their esoteric pursuits, both motivated by the same desire to understand the hidden workings of nature. The eventual divergence between science and esotericism resulted not from scientists proving that all esoteric claims were false, but from the development of different methodologies and standards of evidence, with science focusing on phenomena that could be reliably observed, measured, and reproduced under controlled conditions, while esotericism continued to value subjective experience, symbolic meaning, and transformative practice, even when these could not be submitted to scientific validation. The question of whether these approaches are ultimately incompatible, or whether they address different but complementary aspects of human experience and reality, remains open, with some arguing for a strict separation of domains, and others seeking integration or dialogue between scientific and esoteric ways of knowing. The globalization of esoteric traditions in the modern world, as ideas and practices from different cultures become available to wider audiences and intermingle in new combinations, has created both unprecedented opportunities for cross-cultural learning and risks of superficial appropriation and distortion. The Hermetic tradition, originally a product of Mediterranean cultural exchange, has been further enriched and complicated by encounters with Hindu and Buddhist Tantra, Chinese Taoism, shamanic practices from indigenous cultures, and many other sources, creating syncretic systems that draw eclectically from multiple traditions. Some practitioners and scholars celebrate this creative mixing as producing new forms of spirituality appropriate to a multicultural global society, while others warn that such bricolage often lacks depth, that it cherry-picks appealing elements while ignoring the comprehensive frameworks and ethical demands of the source traditions, and that it can amount to cultural appropriation that benefits privileged consumers while offering nothing back to the communities from which practices were taken. The tension between universalist claims that all wisdom traditions point toward the same ultimate truths and particularist insistence on respecting the integrity and distinctiveness of different traditions continues to shape discussions about how to engage responsibly with esoteric teachings from diverse sources. The future of Hermetic and esoteric traditions in an increasingly technological and scientifically sophisticated culture remains uncertain, with various possible trajectories ranging from continued marginalization and gradual disappearance to creative adaptation and renewed relevance. Some observers predict that as scientific understanding of consciousness, quantum physics, and complex systems continues to develop, contemporary science may arrive at views of reality that resemble in important ways what esoteric traditions have long taught, potentially validating core Hermetic insights about cosmic unity and the creative role of consciousness, while discarding outdated cosmological frameworks and mistaken physical theories. Others suggest that the future lies in psychological and therapeutic applications of esoteric practices, using meditation, visualization, ritual, and symbol work as techniques for mental health, personal development, and consciousness exploration, without necessarily accepting the metaphysical claims of traditional esoteric worldviews. Still others maintain that authentic esoteric traditions will continue much as they have, small streams flowing alongside the mainstream of culture, preserving ancient wisdom for those who seek it while remaining indifferent to whether the larger society recognizes their value or not. The legacy of the Hermetic texts and the traditions they inspired extends beyond any specific doctrines or practices to include a broader contribution to human culture, a reminder that reality may be more mysterious and consciousness more profound than materialist and reductionist frameworks acknowledge, that ancient wisdom traditions preserved insights worth recovering and engaging even when their specific claims need reinterpretation for modern contexts, and that the search for meaning and transcendence is a perennial human endeavor that expresses itself in diverse forms across different eras and cultures. Whether one approaches the Hermetic texts as historical documents illuminating late antique thought, as spiritual teachings offering a path to transformation, as psychological symbols expressing archetypal patterns in the psyche, or as philosophical positions worthy of serious consideration, they remain remarkable artifacts of human intellectual and spiritual creativity. They testify to the long-standing human conviction that surface appearances do not exhaust reality, that there are depths to be plumbed and heights to be scaled, that wisdom is possible and worth pursuing even when the path is difficult and the destination uncertain. The quiet influence of Hermetic ideas in unexpected places, in the work of poets and artists who draw on alchemical symbolism, in therapeutic practices that work with archetypal images and ritual processes, in philosophical reflections on consciousness and reality that echo ancient teachings about mind and cosmos, in ecological thinking that emphasizes interconnection and correspondence between levels of organization, suggests that these ideas continue to circulate and inspire even when disconnected from their original sources and frameworks. The core insight of the Emerald Tablet, that what is above is reflected below, and what is below reflects what is above, that the microcosm and macrocosm mirror each other, that all things are connected in one vast web of correspondence, remains a powerful and generative idea, capable of being expressed in many different vocabularies and applied in many different contexts. This principle of correspondence, of seeking patterns that repeat across different scales and domains, of looking for unity beneath diversity, continues to guide human efforts to make sense of a complex and often bewildering world. As we come to the end of this long exploration, tracing the Hermetic tradition from its origins in Hellenistic Egypt through its Arabic transmission and Renaissance flowering, through its gradual marginalization in the age of science and its various modern revivals and adaptations, we can appreciate both the historical contingency of how these ideas developed and the recurring human concerns they address. The Hermetic texts emerged from a specific time and place, from the cosmopolitan world of late antiquity where diverse cultures met and mingled, but they spoke to questions about meaning, purpose, knowledge, and transformation that humans in many different times and places have grappled with. Their continued study and practice by some, their influence on broader culture, even among those who have never read them, and their status as significant documents in the history of Western esotericism all testify to their enduring power and relevance. The night is deep now, and our journey through this labyrinth of wisdom, both genuine and claimed, both ancient and constantly renewed, draws toward its close, leaving us with questions to ponder and mysteries to contemplate as consciousness gradually releases its hold and sleep approaches fades with its own mysteries and revelations. Good night.